I have told this story many times in the years since the Duke of Thornville became the most talked-about man in 3 counties. I have told it to my wife, who wept at the end and then made me tell it again. I have told it to my eldest son, who declared it the strangest piece of business he had ever heard and went back to his horses. I have told it to the vicar of St. Edmunds, who said it proved something or other about providence and the uses of patience, and then asked me not to include the part about the Countess of Harwick, which I shall include anyway, because it is essential. I have told it to men at my club who did not believe it and men at my club who believed it but found it inexplicable, and to young people who found it romantic in the way of young people who have not yet understood that the distinction between romantic and simply true is much narrower than is generally supposed. I tell it now in full, and from the beginning because I was there from the beginning, and because the beginning is the part most people get wrong. They say he was bewitched. They say he saw a beautiful woman and lost his reason. That is the story the Tun tells itself, because the Tun prefers its dukes either besotted or monstrous, and Crispin Vane had given them precious little of either until that autumn of 1810. The truth is quieter than that and stranger, and, I think, more interesting. The truth is that he spoke to her for perhaps 8 minutes, that he did not even learn her name, that the courier arrived before he could ask it, and when he turned back, she was already moving through the far end of the market, and the crowd closed behind her like water, and she was gone. 8 minutes, no name, 10 years. I was there. I saw his face when he turned and found her absent. I have been trying to describe that expression to myself for a decade, and I have never quite managed it. It was not devastation. He was not the sort of man who showed devastation. It was more like a man who has set down a lamp to pick up something else, and then, turning back, finds the lamp gone and the room suddenly and inexplicably darker than it should be. He stood there for a moment in the middle of the Brentwood Cross Market, with its smell of October apples and wood smoke and damp wool, and he looked at the place where she had been standing, and then he looked at me. "Did you see which way she went?" he said. I had not. I had been arguing with a fishmonger about the price of pike. I had, in fact, been arguing rather effectively, and I had gotten the price down by a meaningful margin, and I had turned around to say something to Crispin about it, and found him standing very still in the middle of the market square, looking at the space between a flower stall and a stall selling dried herbs, and I had understood from his expression that the pike had ceased to be the most interesting development of the afternoon. "No," I said. He nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he turned and walked toward the carriage, and Lord Felton rode up with the letters from London, and the Duke of Thornville was, once again, the most important man in Derbyshire, and there were matters to attend to. That was the autumn of 1810. By the summer of 1820, he had rejected 17 women of excellent family, conducted 4 separate private inquiries across 3 counties, and developed a reputation for coldness so absolute that even his own steward had taken to addressing him in writing rather than in person. His secretary, a man named Groves who had been in the family's employ since before Crispin's father died, and who was entirely devoted to the dukedom if not particularly to the Duke himself, had taken to filing the invitations from matchmaking mothers in a separate drawer from all other correspondence, and labeling that drawer, in Groves's beautiful hand, simply, "The matter of his Grace's domestic arrangements," which Crispin was aware of, and had chosen not to address. All of it, every cold word and every quiet inquiry, pointed back to those 8 minutes in October. I know because I was the one he told. He told me on a Tuesday night in November of 1810, approximately 3 weeks after the market, when we were sitting in his library at Thornville, and he had drunk rather more of his father's good claret than was usual for him. He was 30 years old. He had never, in my experience, been remotely sentimental about anything. Not about the death of his father, not about his brief engagement to Miss Constance Herrick, which he had ended with a letter so precise and so devoid of warmth that Miss Herrick had reportedly burned it, and then, on reflection, framed the ashes, not about the peninsula, which had given him 2 scars and an extraordinary capacity for stillness under fire, and not about the several women who had, over the course of the previous decade, looked at him with the transparent interest of women who are aware that they are in the company of one of the wealthiest men in England. He had been to war and come back from it. He had buried his father and taken on an earldom's worth of responsibility before he was 25. He had navigated London seasons with the composure of a man who regards them as a professional obligation and not a source of entertainment. And he had done all of this with such unvarying correctness that the most anyone had ever accused him of was insufficient warmth, which he appeared to regard as an acceptable cost. He set down his glass very carefully on the table beside him, as men do when they are trying to appear sober, and said, "I cannot stop thinking about her." I said because I had been wondering for 3 weeks whether he would bring it up himself or whether I would have to raise it. "The woman at the market." "Yes." "You spoke to her for less than quarter of an hour." 8 minutes, he said, with a precision that I found simultaneously characteristic and alarming. I counted afterward. Felton's arrival I can date to the quarter hour from his own account. He had come directly from the last stage of the mail and had ridden hard from Ashford Junction, which takes approximately 25 minutes, and he arrived, by his own estimate, at 2:30. We arrived at the market at approximately 2:20 so. "Crispin," I said. He stopped. "You counted backward from a courier's arrival time," I said, "to establish how long you spoke to a woman at a market." "I wanted to know," he said simply. 8 minutes, I agreed, "and you did not get her name." I was about to ask it. He picked up the glass again, looked at the claret, set it back down. "Felton arrived before I could." I considered pointing out that there had been many women in Crispin Vane's life, including 2 who had loved him with great sincerity, and whom he had treated with great courtesy and no particular reciprocation, and that it was therefore curious that this one, unnamed and unmet again, had lodged in him so thoroughly. I considered several ways to say this, and then I did not say any of them because I had known him since we were 8 years old, and I understood that when Crispin said a thing like that, with that precision, that particular quietness, he was not describing a mood. He was describing a condition. He was not the kind of man who mistook moods for conditions, and he was not the kind of man who would count backward from a courier's arrival to establish an elapsed time for a casual encounter. "What was she like?" I asked instead. He was quiet for a long time. The fire had burned low. Outside, the Derbyshire autumn was doing what it always does, which is to make you feel simultaneously comforted and melancholy, as if the world is very old and has seen this all before and is not particularly surprised by any of it. An owl sounded somewhere in the park and then was silent. A log shifted in the grate. "She laughed," he said at last. I waited. I said something, I can't recall exactly what, some passing remark about the quality of the late apples, and she laughed. Not politely. "Genuinely," he paused. "Women do not generally laugh genuinely in my company." This was true. I did not contest it. Women in Crispin's company, particularly women of the kind that his aunt and his social circle produced in quantity every London season, had a tendency to laugh with careful calculation, deploying amusement in the way they deployed their best jewelry. To be seen, to imply certain things, to signal favorable consideration. This was not something I had ever heard Crispin say before, but he said it now without self-pity or bitterness, simply as an observation about how things generally were. "She was selling flowers," he said, "or rather helping someone sell them, an older woman, I think her mother. She had ink on her fingers." He looked at his own hands, turned them over. "I noticed because I was going to make some remark about it, and then I thought it might embarrass her, and then I decided it probably wouldn't, because she didn't seem like a woman who was easily embarrassed, and then I was going to say something else entirely, and then Felton arrived." "What else were you going to say?" I asked. He looked up. This, apparently, was not a question he had expected. He thought about it for a moment. "There was a book in her basket," he said. "Under the flowers, I saw the spine when she shifted the basket to her other arm, some sort of scientific text, I thought natural history, perhaps. I was going to ask about it." He paused. "I couldn't read the full title. I was going to ask which it was." I stared at him. "You are telling me that in the 8 minutes you spent with this woman, you noticed a book in her basket?" "I notice things," he said, without any particular defensiveness. "Most men, when they are struck by a woman at a market, notice her face." "I noticed her face as well," he said, with the tone of a man who is not sure why this needs to be stated. "She was very pretty, but the book was unexpected. A natural history text in a flower seller's basket is not a common observation, and she had ink on her fingers which suggested she had been reading it, not simply carrying it for decoration. And she spoke, He stopped. "How did she speak?" I asked. "Directly," he said. "She spoke to me the way you speak to a person when you have registered their presence and found it not threatening, not deferential, not adjusted." He frowned at his glass. "I said something about the apples, the remark that made her laugh, and she said that in her experience the apples on the west side of any market were invariably the first to go, not because they were the best, but because the western light made them look better than they were. And she said it as if it were simply a true thing, and she were simply saying it, with no particular thought to whether the person she was saying it to was a duke." I thought about this. "She may not have known you were a duke," I said. "Almost certainly not," he agreed. "But my experience is that even people who do not know my precise position are generally careful about how they speak. They sense something, or they see the horse or the quality of the coat, and they adjust." A pause. She did not adjust. "You could find her," I said carefully, "if you made inquiries." "I know." He did not elaborate. I waited to see if he would elaborate, and he did not, and we sat in the library until midnight, and then I went to bed, and in the morning he was entirely himself again, precise, courteous, demanding, remote, and he did not mention the woman with the ink on her fingers for almost 6 months. But I noticed things in those months. I noticed, for instance, that when we rode through Brentwood Cross in the spring of the following year, he let his horse slow to a walk as we passed the market square, and his eyes moved across the stalls with a particular kind of attention that had nothing to do with the quality of the spring cabbages. I noticed that the flower stall was still there, and that an older woman was behind it, and that Crispin looked at the older woman for the half-minute it took us to pass, and then looked away and did not speak. I noticed that he had a conversation with his steward, a Mr. Prentice, that I was not intended to overhear, something about making quiet inquiries in the village, something about a flower seller, something about discretion. Prentice was a discreet man, which was one of his principal qualifications for the post, and he was also a man who had been with the Vane family long enough to know that when the current duke asked for something quietly, he meant it quietly, and that was the end of it. I noticed that the London season of 1811 produced a procession of eligible young women of good family and genuine charm, and that Crispin danced with several of them and conversed with all of them with his customary correctness, and showed not the faintest flicker of anything beyond correctness in any of them. Lady Sophia Ames was beautiful. Miss Philippa Grieve was witty and had excellent opinions on most subjects. The youngest of the Marchioness of Pembridge's daughters was so accomplished at the pianoforte that she reduced 3 separate men to the edge of proposal at a single evening's party. Crispin said kind things to all 3, danced once with each, and went home early every time. He attended to his estates that summer with the concentrated attention he gave to everything, corresponded with his solicitors about a land purchase in the north, and read, in the library at Thornville, a significant number of books about natural history. I did not remark on the books, but I noticed them. In August of 1811, he told me what Prentice had found. We were walking the east boundary of the Thornville Park, which Crispin had been meaning to refence for 2 years, and which we both knew would take at least another 2 years to actually refence, given the pace at which he made decisions about things he considered secondary to more pressing concerns. The morning was clear and cool, and the boundary line ran along a ridge from which you could see most of the eastern valley, and we had walked it in companionable silence for most of an hour before he spoke. "The woman at the flower stall was a Mrs. Dorothea Ashby," he said. "A widow. She sells cut flowers from her garden on market days. She lives approximately 2 miles from the cross in the direction of Hatherwick." He paused. "She had a daughter." I said had. "The daughter is no longer there." He stopped walking, looked out over the valley. "She left some time ago. Prentice could not determine exactly when or where she went. The mother was unresponsive to inquiry." I thought about this. A daughter who had left, a mother who would not say where. There were several possible explanations, some comfortable and some not. "Do you have a name?" I asked. Something passed across his face, very quickly, in the way things passed across Crispin's face when they mattered, and he preferred not to let them show entirely. "Nell," he said. "Just the one name. No surname, no direction, no map. Just Nell." I did not ask how he knew even that much, whether Prentice had gotten it from the mother or from a neighbor or from some other source. I simply accepted it as the piece of information it was, a fragment, a beginning. Well, I said. Yes, said Crispin. And that was the end of that conversation. The winter of 1811 passed. The spring of 1812 came in cold and wet, the way Derbyshire springs sometimes do, as if the winter has decided to argue the point a little longer before conceding. I spent March at Thornville due to my own house having an infestation of some sort in the east wing that my housekeeper described as a situation requiring professional consultation, and that turned out to be a family of jackdaws. By April, the jackdaws were gone and I was back in my own house. But I had grown, in those winter months, accustomed to spending a good deal of my time at Thornville, and I continued to do so. Crispin, in those months, was not noticeably different from his ordinary self. He managed the estate. He was exacting with the account books. He corresponded with a geologist at Oxford about the limestone formations in the north of the estate, which was a subject he had developed a serious interest in over the previous year. He was pleasant to his household, correctly formal with his neighbors, and inaccessible to most of the social world, which had decided by the spring of 1812 that the Duke of Thornville was either too proud or too strange to marry, and was proceeding accordingly. What no one outside of Prentice and myself knew was that the inquiry was continuing. Prentice, in the spring of 1812, widened the search. He had already spoken to several people in and around Brentwood Cross without eliciting anything useful. The mother was silent on the subject of her daughter, and the neighbors of the mother were either genuinely ignorant or, as Prentice suspected, being loyal to a woman who clearly wished her daughter's whereabouts kept quiet. But Prentice was thorough in the specific way of men who have been employed by exacting dukes long enough to understand that thoroughness is not optional. He went further afield. He spoke to the vicar of St. Michael's at Brentwood Cross, who was a man of broad acquaintance and moderate memory, and who said that he recalled a Miss Eleanor Ashby who had been confirmed in his church some 15 years before, and who had been, now that he thought of it, an unusually attentive student of the confirmation classes, and who had asked him questions about the classification of plants in the Bible that he had found both surprising and somewhat difficult to answer. Eleanor's. He told me this on a June evening, when the light in the Thornville library was long and golden, and there was the smell of cut hay coming from the western fields. Eleanor Ashby, I said. Confirmed at St. Michael's, Brentwood Cross. Approximately 15 years ago, which would make her? He paused, calculating. Approximately 23 or 24, I said. Yes, he looked at the fire, and she asked the vicar about the classification of plants. In the confirmation class. In the confirmation class. He was quiet for a moment. She asked about Linnean classification specifically, whether the Latin nomenclature superseded the older folk names, and if so, what was lost in the supersession. I stared at him. The vicar told you this in detail. He remembered it because he hadn't been able to answer it satisfactorily and had thought about it afterward. A slight pause. He said she had a book with her, a natural history text. Of course she did. The surname gave them a direction. Prentice, with the name Eleanor Ashby and the general understanding that she had gone from Derbyshire to somewhere in the recent past, cast a somewhat wider net. He wrote to every family in the surrounding county who might have employed a young woman as a governess. He wrote to the headmistress of a charity school in Derby, who occasionally placed educated young women in suitable posts in other parts of the country. He wrote to a clergyman's society in Chesterfield that maintained a register of schoolmistresses in the region. The charity school headmistress, a Mrs. Gresham, wrote back to say that she had placed a Miss E. Ashby of Derbyshire in a family in the West Riding of Yorkshire in the early spring of 1811. The family were mill owners named Castleton. The position was that of private tutor to the two elder Castleton children. Yorkshire, a specific county, a specific family. Crispin received this letter in July of 1812. He read it at his desk. I was on the other side of the library, engaged with a week-old newspaper, and I looked up at the quality of the silence that followed the letter's opening. Yorkshire, I said. The West Riding, he set the letter down. A family named Castleton, mill owners. Another pause. The position was as private tutor to their children. I absorbed this. A mill owner's household in Yorkshire, a private tutor. Not a servant, precisely. Tutors occupied a peculiar middle position in country households, neither family nor fully staff, required to be educated enough to teach but kept socially at arm's length. It was not a comfortable position for anyone who had a particular sense of their own dignity, which, on the evidence, Eleanor Ashby might well have. "Are you going to write to the Castletons?" I asked. He looked at the letter for a moment. "Prentice will make inquiries first." Prentice made inquiries. The inquiries produced the information that Mr. Castleton had died of a fever in the winter of 1811, and that his widow had subsequently taken the children to live with her parents in Edinburgh. The household at the Castleton Mill had been largely dispersed. The tutor, a Miss E., the housekeeper recalled, had left the previous year, when it became clear the family was removing to Scotland. She had left on good terms. She had been very good with the children, particularly the older boy, who had a tendency to resist instruction, but who had apparently found in Miss E. a teacher equal to his resistance. She had gone south, the housekeeper believed. South was not helpful. "South," I said. "South," Crispin agreed. It was August of 1812. The trail had gone from Brentwood Cross to the West Riding, and then dispersed southward into England with no further particularity. Crispin set the inquiry aside, not abandoned, but set aside, like a letter that requires more information before it can be properly answered. He went to London for the latter part of the season that autumn, which he had missed entirely that spring, and he appeared in society with his customary correctness, and he danced with Lady Sophia Ames again, who had somehow not yet found a husband despite being beautiful and witty and well-connected, and he said pleasant things to her and then went home before supper. And Lady Sophia Ames told her best friend, who told her best friend, who told my wife, who told me, that she was beginning to suspect the Duke of Thornville was not simply cold, but specifically cold toward her, which she found baffling, and which I understood completely. The winter of 1812 was cold, and the spring of 1813 was not much warmer. The London season of 1813 produced, among other things, Lady Margaret Thornton, who was the most relentlessly eligible woman of that particular year, and who had been aimed at the Duke of Thornville with the open precision of a parent who has done all calculations and reached an obvious conclusion. Lady Margaret was beautiful. She had dark hair and clear gray eyes and an excellent figure, and she played the pianoforte very well and had been to school on the continent and could conduct a conversation in French, Italian, and German with some fluency. Her father was an earl with extensive investments in the north, which made an alliance with the Duke of Thornville both socially and financially sensible. Lady Margaret herself was not unintelligent, but carefully so. She had learned, in the way that young women of her class learned, to deploy intelligence selectively, in the directions and at the volumes that the occasion required, and to keep the rest of it out of view. She and Crispin conversed at the Hatfield ball in May with a correctness so mutual, and so complete that I, watching from a distance, had a sudden cold certainty that something was about to go wrong, and went wrong it duly did, because Crispin said something about the heat and went home early, and Lady Margaret was engaged to a baronet by the following January, and seemed, on the whole, relieved. I asked him about it directly, 2 days after the Hatfield ball. "She was entirely suitable," he said, with the tone of a man closing a dossier. "But—" a long pause. He was at his desk. He had been writing something that looked like correspondence about limestone. He put down the pen. She was not herself. I waited. "She was what she had been formed to be," he said carefully. "Very accurately, very carefully, but the person she had been formed to be was not her, not anyone's particular self. It was a composite, a very good one." He picked up the pen again, turned it between his fingers. "I did not feel in her company that I was speaking to a person." I considered this. "Some people might argue," I said, "that you are being unreasonable, that what you are describing as a composite is simply what people become in society. That the kind of directness you encountered at a market in Derbyshire is a thing of modest circumstances, and that modest circumstances are not what a duke's wife generally has." He looked at me with an expression that acknowledged the accuracy of this argument and its complete irrelevance to his actual situation. "She also reminded me of no one I had ever met," he said, "which is, apparently, a specific difficulty." I understood then, in a way I had not quite understood before that moment, what was actually happening. It was not that he was comparing every woman to Eleanor Ashby and finding them wanting on the basis of their looks or their manners or their accomplishments. It was something stranger and more inconvenient than that. It was that he had encountered, briefly and unexpectedly, a particular quality of being, a way of occupying a conversation that was genuinely and entirely her own, and that this quality had imprinted itself on him with a completeness he had not anticipated and could not subsequently undo. Everything that was not that quality felt to him not quite right, not wrong, not deficient, simply not that. Like a note played a half tone off the key you expected. "I think you may be difficult to marry," I said. "Yes," he said, "I believe that is the general consensus." He said it without self-pity, which was characteristic. He was not, I think, suffering from this in the way that some men suffer when they cannot have what they want. He had an extraordinary ability to carry something difficult without the carrying showing as distress. What he had, instead, was a particular quality of absence, of something that would have been there, but wasn't, that I noticed only because I had known him for so long. He was not unhappy. He was simply incomplete in a specific way, and he knew it, and he was waiting. The summer of 1813 was fine and warm. We spent much of it at Thornville, riding the estate and arguing about the geological composition of the East Ridge and reading in the evenings. A family of Crispin's cousins came to stay for a fortnight in August, bringing with them 5 children and a governess named Miss Parkhurst, and the house was briefly very full and rather louder than usual. I watched Crispin with the children, who adored him in the baffling way that children often adore people who are very still and entirely serious, because they sense that stillness as a form of attention and find it enormously comforting. Miss Parkhurst, observing the same thing, said to me privately that the Duke was very good with children, and that it was a pity he hadn't any of his own yet, and I said yes, and did not elaborate, and she looked at me with the bright eyes of a woman who can tell when a sentence has been shortened, and we had a very pleasant conversation about something entirely different for the rest of the afternoon. In October of 1813, exactly 3 years after the market at Brentwood Cross, Prentice produced another name. He had continued to follow up on the general movement of educated young women moving south from Yorkshire in the spring and summer of 1812. It was slow, uncertain work, dependent on the long chains of acquaintance that connect English country people to one another in ways that are not readily visible from the outside, but which, if you find the right link, can be followed with some persistence. Prentice had found a link. A clergyman in Lancashire who was the cousin of the minister at the church in the Castleton village in Yorkshire, who had heard, through that cousin, that the former Castleton tutor had gone south and then west, and had taken a position as a governess with a family in Lancashire. The family was named Pemfrey. They lived in a house called Coppice Hall, 6 miles from the town of Burnley. The governess had come to them in the autumn of 1812 and had been with them, so the clergyman believed, until recently. Crispin received this information on a Tuesday in October. He sent Prentice to Lancashire the following Monday. Prentice came back 3 weeks later. He had found Coppice Hall. He had spoken to the housekeeper, a Mrs. Alton. The governess, a Miss Aliner, surname not given to the household, which was unusual but which Mrs. Alton had attributed to the governess's general preference for privacy, had indeed been with the Pemfreys for approximately a year. She had left in the spring of 1813, so approximately 6 months before Prentice's arrival. She had left on good terms. The Pemfrey children had been very sorry to see her go. Mrs. Pemfrey had been sorry to lose her, having found her unusually capable, and Mrs. Alton said, with some emphasis, unusually sensible, which Mrs. Alton regarded as a rarer quality than cleverness. She had gone south, again or possibly east. Mrs. Alton was not certain. "South or east," I said when Crispin told me. Yes, he was at his desk. It was November by then, raining hard outside, and the fire was the warmest thing in the room. She has a habit of being 6 months ahead of the inquiry. "It may not be deliberate," I said. "Positions end. Women in her situation move on to the next thing." "I know," he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Alton said she was unusually sensible." I let that sit. "She also said," he continued, "that Miss Aliner had given the elder Pemfrey girl a text on natural history as a leaving gift, from her own collection. The natural history collection, the book under the flowers, the woman who had asked the confirmation vicar about Linnean classification and folk names." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate. The inquiry paused again. Crispin went to London for the winter months of 1813 and into 1814, because there were parliamentary matters that required his attention, and because his solicitors had identified a situation with a border property that needed to be resolved in person. He was in London for 5 months. I went up for part of it. He appeared at the necessary social events, conducted his business, attended the house on the relevant occasions, and came back to Thornville in April of 1814 with 2 new pieces of correspondence about the limestone formations, and a quiet that had the particular quality, I thought, of a man who has been in a city for 5 months, and has confirmed for himself again that nothing in the city is what he is looking for. In the summer of 1814, Prentice found a new lead. An advertisement placed in 3 county papers, carefully worded, describing a young woman of education and natural history expertise, formerly in employment as a governess and tutor, produced a letter from a schoolmistress's society in the East Riding of Yorkshire. A woman matching the description, brown hair, light eyes, quiet manner, carrying a book, had been employed as a junior schoolmistress in a village school near the town of Beverley from the spring of 1813 until the previous year. Another trail, another direction. Prentice went to Beverley. The school was a small charity school with 3 teachers and approximately 40 children. The position had been filled by a Miss Aliner, the schoolmaster confirmed. He called her that because she had asked him to, preferring not to use her surname in the school, which was unusual but which he had respected. She had been excellent with the children. She had introduced a system for the older students that combined reading instruction with nature observation, which had been popular with the children and baffling to the parents, some of whom had not entirely understood why reading and looking at plants were connected, but who had come around when their children demonstrated an unexpected ability to describe things they had seen in accurate and interesting language. She had left in the spring of 1814. She had gone, the schoolmaster thought, north. Back north. I received a letter from Crispin about this development. He was at Thornville. I was in the country with my wife and our first son, who had been born in January of that year and who was taking up a significant portion of my attention. The letter was brief, as Crispin's letters always were, and said only, East Riding, spring 1813 to spring 1814. Schoolmistress, gone north. The handwriting was, I noticed, absolutely steady, which in another man might have been reassuring, and in Crispin told me precisely nothing. I wrote back, I said, County Durham, I would guess, or Northumberland. He did not write back to confirm or deny this. He simply, I found out later, asked Prentice to extend the inquiry north. The autumn of 1814 and the winter of 1815 produced nothing definitive. The northern counties were large. The network of connections that Prentice could follow was thinning at the edges. He placed more advertisements. He wrote to more clergymen. He spoke to a woman's society in Newcastle, who maintained a partial register of schoolmistresses in the northeast of England, and who said that they had had a brief correspondence with a Miss E. Ashby of Derbyshire, inquiring about positions in the area approximately 2 years before, but they had had no correspondence since, and did not know whether she had taken a position in the region or gone elsewhere. Miss E. Ashby, the full surname for the first time from an official source. I was not there when Crispin received this letter. He sent me a note that said simply, confirmed Ashby, any region circa 1812-13, still looking, no other commentary. He went to the peninsula that spring, to attend to some affairs relating to a regiment friend who had died without proper arrangement of his papers, and to see the country again. And I thought, though he did not say so, to give himself some distance from the inquiry, which had been producing fragments without the central piece for long enough that even a very patient man might need to breathe different air for a time. He came back from Portugal in October of 1815 thinner and quieter, and I thought, somewhat more at peace with himself, not reconciled to the loss, exactly, but more able to carry it without the carrying showing quite so plainly on his face. He had a tan from the Portuguese sun. He had brought back 2 books, one a Portuguese natural history of the peninsula, which struck me as characteristic, and one a small volume of Portuguese poetry, which I had never seen him acquire before and which struck me as not characteristic at all, and which I filed under the general heading of things the peninsula apparently did to a man. The London season of 1816 was notable primarily for the appearance of the Countess of Harwick. The Countess of Harwick was 37 years old, recently widowed, and possessed of a fortune sufficient to make her a desirable match by any social calculation. She was also, and this was the part that made her unusual, genuinely clever in an unconcerned, unperforming way that reminded me, the first time I spoke to her, of exactly the quality Crispin had described in the woman at the market. She said what she thought. She laughed when she found things funny, not when she found it useful to appear to. She had a particular way of looking at a person that told you she had just registered exactly what you meant, including the part you hadn't said. She and Crispin met at a dinner at Lord Wexmoor's house in May. I was there. I watched them. They had a long conversation about political economy, which was not a subject usually discussed at Lord Wexmoor's dinners, and they had it with a mutual directness that I found, frankly, rather startling. The Countess said several things to Crispin that I would have expected to produce either defense or approval, and he produced neither. He simply engaged with them as propositions, agreed where they seemed right and pushed back where they seemed wrong, and the Countess received the pushback with the particular pleasure of a woman who has been right a great deal, and is finding the occasional resistance refreshing. I thought, watching this, that it was the closest I had seen Crispin come, in 6 years, to something that resembled what he had described at the market. I also noticed that he noticed this himself, and that this was not, for him, comfortable. He came to find me after dinner when the party had dispersed somewhat. He said nothing for a moment. We were standing near a window in Lord Wexmoor's library, which was cold because the fire had not been properly laid, and Lord Wexmoor's library was largely decorative. "She is remarkable," he said. Yes, I agreed. It would be entirely reasonable. Entirely, I said. A long pause. But it isn't the same thing, he said. I looked at him carefully. Is that what you have decided? It's what I notice, he said. It is very like the thing, and it is not the thing. He turned from the window. I cannot explain it more precisely than that. I thought about this for some time, and I decided finally that I believed him, not because his logic was sound, which it was not, by any standard logic could be said to apply to the situation, but because I trusted his judgment about his own perception. Crispin was not a man who made things up. If he said it was not the same thing, it was not the same thing. If he said the Countess of Harwick, who was genuinely remarkable, did not produce in him what a leaner Ashby had produced in 8 minutes at a market, then that was the truth of it. All right, I said. He nodded. We did not speak of it further. The Countess of Harwick married a Scottish peer the following year and moved to Edinburgh and seemed, from all I heard of her, which was occasional and second-hand, perfectly satisfied. I have wondered sometimes what she would have made of the whole business. If she had known, she was one of several women who had come close to filling a space that was already very specifically occupied by someone who didn't know she was occupying it. The years 1816 and 1817 were the most difficult ones, I think, in the aggregate. Not because anything in particular went wrong. Nothing did. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to as a crisis. Simply because there is a particular quality of difficulty that belongs to long, quiet waiting, which is different from the difficulty of acute unhappiness and in some ways harder to sustain. Acute unhappiness has at least the advantage of being visible to itself. Long, quiet waiting has to be lived inside of, year after year, without particular relief and without particular worsening, and the man who does it must find ways to keep it from becoming the whole of his life. Crispin found ways. He was extremely good at finding ways. He was genuinely interested in his estates and his geological work, in the parliamentary matters that required his attention, in the books he read, in the chess games he played with me 3 evenings a week. He was not performing this interest as a way of distracting himself from something else. He was actually interested. This is one of the things that made him, as a man, unusual. He was capable of being fully present to several things at once, and the incompleteness that lived in him alongside those things did not hollow them out. But I knew it was there. I knew because of the geological specimens he acquired that autumn, not limestone this time, but chalk, specifically, because chalk was the predominant rock of Sussex and Dorset and certain parts of the South Downs, and he had been in those areas that summer following a lead from Prentice that turned out, again, not to be the right woman. The chalk specimens were on his desk for a month before he put them away. The lead in 1817 was the most significant one yet. A letter arrived for Prentice, not Crispin, which was what made it unusual from a Mrs. Phoebe Good. the wife of a clergyman in Lancashire, who had seen an advertisement placed in a Lancaster paper, and who wrote to say she believed she might have information about the person sought. She had been in service with a family named Ashby in Derbyshire, some years past before her marriage. The daughter of the house, Eleanor, called Nell, had been a clever, serious girl with a habit of reading. She had heard from a cousin who had remained in the area that the daughter had gone away to take up a position somewhere to the north, but she had not had news of her since. She did not know where Miss Ashby was now, but she had once heard her speak of a cousin, or perhaps a second cousin, in the north of England, and she thought this cousin might be in Lancashire or Northumberland. She wasn't certain which. This was not in itself a great deal, but it confirmed the name and the origin and the direction of travel, and it gave, for the first time, a possible connection in the north, a relative, unknown but potentially traceable. Crispin received this information in September of 1817. He was at Thornville. I was there by now spending more time at his house than my own, partly because my wife's family had descended on us for the autumn, and my house was very full, and partly because I had developed, over the years, the habit of being at Thornville when things happened. He told me about Mrs. Good's letter over dinner, in the even way he had of conveying important information. A cousin in Northumberland or Lancashire, I said. Possibly, Mrs. Good was not certain. That is still 2 large counties. Yes, he served himself from the dish in front of him without looking at it, but it is a direction. I looked at him across the table. He looked back at me with the expression he always had when conveying information about the inquiry, careful, composed, not permitting himself anything beyond the facts. Crispin, I said. Hadley, how long will you keep looking? He considered the question with genuine seriousness, the way he considered most questions. Until I find her, he said, or until she cannot be found. And if she cannot be found? Then I will know that, he said, and I will proceed from that. I did not ask what proceeding from that would look like. I thought I knew which was, very much as it already looked minus the inquiry. He would manage the estate, he would read books, he would beat me at chess, he would not marry. You are, I said with some care, one of the most stubborn men I have ever known. I am aware of that, he said. In this particular instance, I said, I believe you are right. He looked at me for a moment, and something in his face shifted very slightly in the way things shifted in his face when he registered something that mattered. Do you? He said. I believe that the quality you described at the market is real. I believe it was real in the 8 minutes you knew it. I believe that looking for it rather than settling for something else is not foolishness. I paused. I also believe that you will find her. Not because I have any particular evidence for this, but because in 37 years I have never known you to fail at something you had decided to do. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Hadley, he said. You're welcome, I said. We ate in silence for a while. The autumn evening was settling outside, and the lights in the dining room were lit, and the fire was good, and everything was as it always was. The book in her basket, I said presently. He looked up. A survey of British flora, I said. Is that what the Stanhope vicar said? Yes, something in his voice was slightly different. She had given it to a child in the Stanhope school as a leaving present. He had recognized the text from a previous conversation they had had about botanical classification. She gave a child a book from her own collection. Yes. I nodded. That told you something, I thought. That told you something very specific about the kind of woman she was. Not the kind of thing you felt it was appropriate to say out loud under the circumstances, but something I filed carefully away in my understanding of the situation. The winter of 1817 and the spring of 1818 produced the lead in County Durham. A letter from a vicar named Holloway in Stanhope, the same lead that had brought Crispin to the north in the spring of 1818, identified a Miss Eleanor who had worked in the village school for approximately 2 years and who had left in December of the previous year. He went himself, he came back without her. I have described that return already. What I did not describe, because I was not certain of it then, was what I learned in the months that followed about why she had left. This is the part of the story that is not comfortable to tell, and which I will tell briefly, because it belongs to Eleanor Ashby and not to me, and because she told it herself, eventually in her own words, and those words are not mine to carry into this account. What I will say is this: she had left Derbyshire in a hurry. There had been a difficulty, the word that Prentice had used, the word that the Stanhope vicar used, the word that Mrs. Alton at the Pemfrey house had implied without stating. And the difficulty was the kind that a young woman without family support and without financial independence is particularly vulnerable to, and which she had managed with the determination and capability that characterized everything she did. She had managed it by leaving, and by leaving again and again, because the world has a tendency to follow a woman who has once been in a difficult situation, or at least to send its version of events ahead of her. And so she had put distance between herself and each successive position when the distance started to feel necessary. I understood this gradually, piecing it together from fragments. Things Crispin told me that he had learned from the people who had employed her, things that were said and not said, things that the pattern of her movements implied about the nature of each departure. I understood it more fully when I eventually met her, because when you meet a person, you meet all the years that have made them. And Eleanor Ashby at 30, in the schoolroom in Caldburn in the April of 1820, was not simply the woman who had laughed at the market in 1810. She was also the woman who had spent the subsequent decade learning, very thoroughly, that the world had specific ideas about what a woman in her position was owed, and that those ideas were not particularly generous, and that the best response to them was not anger but competence and mobility. She had made herself competent, she had stayed mobile, and she had built in Caldburn, in the quiet of a Northumberland village school, the closest thing to a settled life she had managed in a decade. But I am ahead of myself. In 1818, Crispin came back from Stanhope with the knowledge that she was 6 months ahead of him again. He set the inquiry aside again and attended to his estates. He finished the paper on the East Ridge limestone formations that he had been working on for the better part of 2 years and sent it to the geologist at Oxford, who replied with great enthusiasm and a counter-argument that produced a satisfying correspondence for the rest of the year. In 1819, there were 2 false leads. One was a woman named Eleanor in Northumberland who was a widow with 3 children and had never worked as a schoolmistress. One was a Miss E. Ashby in the West Country who turned out to be a different Miss E. Ashby entirely, with no connection to Derbyshire and no natural history texts in evidence. Crispin received each piece of news with the same composure. He thanked Prentice. He continued to look. By the spring of 1820, Prentice had been making inquiries for 9 years and was himself beginning to show the faint signs of a man who has been following a trail for a long time without finding the end of it. Not doubt, exactly. He was too professional for doubt, but a kind of careful hopefulness whenever he had something new to report, as if he had learned to be precise about his expectations. He had something new to report in March of 1820. A letter had arrived, not responding to an advertisement, not from any of the established networks of inquiry. It had arrived addressed to Prentice himself, from a Mrs. Phoebe Fallow in a village called Caldburn in Northumberland. Mrs. Fallow wrote that she had heard, from a cousin in County Durham who had heard from the Stanhope vicar, that a gentleman was seeking a Miss Eleanor who had worked as a schoolmistress. She wished to know whether the gentleman in question was the same gentleman who had made inquiries in Stanhope in the spring of 1818. The letter was cautious. Mrs. Fallow did not say that she knew the person sought. She said she wished to know the nature of the gentleman's interest. Crispin read this letter twice, then he wrote back the same day. I was in the library when he wrote it. He drafted it 3 times, which was not like him. He generally wrote things once and sent them. The first draft he crossed out after 2 sentences. The second draft he read through twice and then set aside. The third draft he read through once, paused, and then folded and sealed and handed to Prentice for the Morning Post. Afterward, he told me what he had written. I will reproduce it here approximately because it matters. He had written that his interest was entirely honorable, that he had met the woman in question briefly years ago and had been unable, due to circumstances, to learn her name, that he had spent the subsequent years trying to find her, for the purpose of making her an offer of marriage if she were agreeable to receiving it, that he was aware she was under no obligation of any kind to receive such an offer or to speak with him at all, that he asked Mrs. Fallow to use her own judgment about whether to share this information or not share it, as she thought best for the person concerned. He gave the letter to Prentice. Prentice posted it, then we waited. Mrs. Fallow's reply came in 2 weeks. It was brief, but it was conclusive. She wrote that she did know the person sought. She wrote that she had communicated, in substance, the content of his letter to the person in question. She wrote that the person in question had said she would be willing to receive a visitor if the gentleman wished to call. He read this letter standing by the window of his study at Thornville, with the morning light coming in from the east and the park spread out below him, the April daffodils showing at the edge of the wood. I watched him read it. I watched him finish reading it and remain standing by the window for a moment, holding the letter at his side. Then he turned. "She will see me," he said. His face was doing the thing I had not found a word for all those years before, standing in the market in October. Except the lamp this time was not gone. The lamp was lit. The room was at last the right temperature. "Yes," I said. "She might say no," he said. "When I arrive, when she knows very little about me. She met me for 8 minutes 9 years ago. She might take one look and—" "Crispin," I said. "Yes." "Go to Northumberland." He went. This time I went with him. I will not account again for why I went, except to say that when your oldest friend has been doing something remarkable and painful and entirely without complaint for 9 years, and the thing is finally near its resolution, you go. That is the end of the explanation. We traveled 3 days north, through the particular change of country that happens as you cross into Northumberland. The hills getting bigger, the sky getting whiter, the stone of the villages going from brown to gray, the whole landscape becoming simultaneously more austere and more open than anything further south. It was April, and the spring came later here, and the hillsides were still the pale brown gold of the previous year's grass with only the first suggestion of new green at the edges. Crispin was quiet throughout the journey. He read. He looked out the window. He ate adequately and slept, as far as I could tell, reasonably well. He played me one game of chess on the second evening and won it in 12 moves, which told me something about the state of his concentration. We arrived in Caldburn on the evening of the 3rd day. It was a small village, arranged along 2 principal streets with the comfortable irregularity of English villages that have been added to over several centuries without any particular plan. There was a church of old gray stone, and a school beside it, a newer building, still gray stone, with long windows that caught the last of the evening light, and a market square rather smaller than the one at Brentwood Cross. There was an inn and several shops, and houses with gardens that showed the particular northern spring of early flowering things, primroses, wood anemones, the first tips of daffodils coming up through the pale grass. We put up at the inn, which was clean and adequate, and Crispin sent a note to Mrs. Fallow the following morning. Mrs. Fallow arrived herself, rather than sending a reply, which I had not quite anticipated. She was a woman of perhaps 50, brisk and competent, with the manner of someone who has organized a great deal and has learned to take the measure of a person quickly and act accordingly. She sat down at the table across from us and looked at Crispin for rather longer than was polite. He bore the examination without flinching. She seemed to find this satisfactory. "Your Grace," she said, "I have spoken with Alina again this morning. She knows you are here." "How did she receive the information?" he said. Mrs. Fallow considered. "Carefully," she said. It was, I thought, a very precise word. "She is not a rash person. She asked me several questions about your character, which I could not entirely answer, not knowing you myself. But I told her what I had been able to establish, which was that you have been looking for her for 9 years, and that every person Prentice had spoken to in the course of that search had indicated that your intentions were serious and your conduct throughout had been entirely correct." She paused. "She also said something I thought was worth telling you." "Please," said Crispin. "She said she had wondered sometimes whether you were real." Mrs. Fallow said it simply, without flourish. She had thought about the day at the market. She remembered it. She was clear about that. And she had sometimes wondered whether the person she remembered was real or whether she had made him better than he was over time. Crispin was very still. "And she also asked me," Mrs. Fallow continued, "to ask you something before she agreed to meet you." "Anything," he said. "She wants to know what you said to her, at the market. She says she remembers the day clearly, but she cannot remember exactly what you said that made her laugh." The room was quiet for a moment. "I said," he replied carefully, and with the precision of a man who has had 9 years to commit something to memory, That the late apples at the stall next to hers appeared inferior to those I had seen in the village the previous autumn, and that in my experience, the superiority of any produce at any market was inversely proportional to the prominence of the stall displaying it, and that the best apples in the county were therefore probably being sold quietly at the end of the row by someone who had not thought to advertise them particularly. Mrs. Fallow blinked. That is extremely specific. I remember it, he said simply. She looked at him for another moment. Then she smiled, once, briefly, with the satisfaction of a woman who has taken a measure and found it as she expected. I will tell her, she said. She got up, she went. We waited. I poured the coffee, which was by this time cold, and we drank it cold, and neither of us said anything. He had spent 9 years finding this woman. He was now in the same village as this woman. She knew he was here. She had asked what he said, and he had told her, and Mrs. Fallow had gone to tell her, and that was all we could do until she decided. An hour later, Mrs. Fallow returned. She will see you, she said. This morning, if you wish, at the schoolhouse. She has dismissed the children. He stood up. He was dressed very correctly. He was always dressed very correctly. But there was a moment when he looked down at himself with the faint expression of a man who is checking that he is, in fact, fully dressed. And it was so uncharacteristic and so entirely human that I felt something very warm for him, which I kept entirely to myself. Hadley, he said. I stood as well. You are exactly what you are, I told him. And what you are is a man who has been looking for her for 10 years. She knows that. Go tell her the rest. He put on his hat and went. I stayed at the inn. I want to say something about that hour, because it has its own character that I think is worth preserving. I sat at the table where we had drunk cold coffee, and I looked at a map of Northumberland that was hanging on the wall, and I thought about everything I had watched over the previous 9 years. The claret in the library in November of 1810, the slowing of his horse as we passed the market in 1811, the careful letters to Prentice and the careful letters from Prentice, the women in the London seasons who came close but were not quite right, the false leads and the cold trails. The chalk specimens on his desk after the Sussex inquiry, the Portuguese poetry book he had brought back from the peninsula. I thought about what it meant to carry something for 9 years without letting it become either a wound or an obsession, or, more precisely, to let it be both of those things and to keep working and reading and managing estates, and being interested in geology and Parliament and the price of good coal, and to do all of that without ever quite being at full capacity, because some portion of your capacity was always being used for the carrying. I thought about Eleanor Ashby, whom I had never met, who had left Derbyshire under difficult circumstances and had made herself a schoolmistress in Northumberland, and who was at this moment standing in a schoolroom 3 streets away from where I was sitting, talking to the man who had been looking for her for 9 years. I was, I admit, nervous on his behalf. I was also something else, something more complicated than nervous. I was hopeful in the way you are hopeful about something that has been improbable for a very long time and is suddenly, at last, becoming possible. I drank the cold coffee. I looked at the map. I waited. He came back in 2 hours. He came in through the door of the inn, and I looked at his face, and I knew before he said anything. He sat down across from me. He was quiet for a moment, as he often was when things mattered enough that he wanted to get the words right. She is exactly as I thought, he said. I waited. She is more as well, he said, than I could have known from 8 minutes. A pause. We spoke for 2 hours. We disagreed about observation versus record in natural history. She's entirely right that direct observation is irreplaceable, but that the literature provides the language, and I argued the other side too long before I admitted it, which she found funny and said so. Another pause. She also said something about the cost of ink that was the funniest thing I have heard in 9 years, and I will not repeat it because it was specific to the context and would not transfer. But I said, I have asked her to marry me, he said. She has not said yes. She has said she will write to her mother, and that she needs time to think, and that she would like me to come back in a fortnight. And you have agreed to that? Of course. He looked at me with the expression he wore when he found a question slightly superfluous. I have waited 9 years. A fortnight is. A fortnight, I agreed. He nodded. He picked up the cold coffee and drank it without appearing to notice it was cold. Hadley, he said. Yes. She remembers the apples. I know, I said. She was composing an answer to the question she thought I was going to ask, about the book. She was going to say that direct observation and the literature are not opposites, that the best naturalists use both. She had the answer ready. He set the cup down. For 9 years she had that answer ready, and I didn't arrive to receive it. I looked at him. "You arrived now," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I arrived now." We stayed in Caldburn another day, because there was no particular reason to rush back to Thornville, and because I found I wanted to see the village. I walked it that afternoon while Crispin was writing a letter to his steward about some estate matter or other, and I went past the schoolhouse, which was a modest stone building with a small garden to the side where someone had planted early bulbs, and I looked at the windows, which were dark now that the children were gone for the day, and I thought about what it meant to have built something small and good and solid in a place where no one particularly knew you, with no resources and no family support, and nothing but your own capability. The letter from Eleanor Ashby arrived at Thornville 11 days into the fortnight. Crispin read it in the library. I was not there when he read it. I came in 10 minutes later and found him standing at the window. He had the letter at his side. He was looking out at the park. His face was doing the thing I did not have a word for. I found a word for it later, and I have already given it. He was happy. Not the happiness of acquisition, not the happiness of relief, but the deep, quiet happiness of a man who has arrived somewhere he was always meant to go and found it, in the fullest sense of the word, exactly right. "Yes," I said. "Yes," he said. He turned from the window. The smile was there, the particular one, the one that belonged entirely to this situation and no other. "She also writes," he said, "that she has told her mother, and that her mother said it was about time, and that any man who spent 9 years looking for a woman on the basis of 8 minutes was either a fool or worth marrying, and that she had never thought Nell attracted fools." I laughed. "Mrs. Dorothea Ashby," I said. "I want to meet her." "You will," he said. "She is coming to Caldburn for the wedding." A pause. "She is buying a new bonnet." "As she should," I said. He went back to Northumberland the following week. Again, I went with him. This time Mrs. Fallow had arranged for us to stay with a neighbor, a Mr. and Mrs. Tanner of a house at the edge of the village, and the village knew why we were there, and several children could be seen at various windows as the carriage came in, and one of them, a girl of perhaps 8 years old, waved with great enthusiasm from a doorway. Miss Ashby, Eleanor, met us at the door of the schoolhouse. She was wearing a plain gray dress of good quality but practical make, and her light brown hair was pinned up with the efficiency of a woman who has things to do in the morning and does not spend time on arrangements that are not required. She had, I noticed, ink on her fingers. She noticed me noticing and looked at her hand and said, "The geography lesson ran long," which was, I thought, an entirely appropriate explanation and also, under the circumstances, rather funny, and I told her so. She shook Crispin's hand, and then mine, and said it was extremely gratifying to meet me at last, given that from everything she had gathered I had been a central figure in the entire business. And I told her that I had been primarily a witness, which was the most accurate description, and she said that in her experience a good witness was harder to find than a good participant. Then she looked at Crispin, and he looked at her, and there was a moment of the particular quality that belongs to two people who have been the subject of an improbable and significant thing, and are finally in the same room at the same time and finding each other, actually and in person, exactly as they expected and more. "You still have ink on your fingers," he said. "I generally do," she said. "Yes," he said, "I thought you might." I excused myself after a certain point and went to sit with the Tanners, who were very kind about it and produced an excellent quantity of seed cake, and I had 3 pieces and felt entirely justified. The wedding was 6 weeks later, in the church at Caldburn, on a morning in June when the Northumberland hills were green in every direction, and the light was the long, clear light of northern summer. It was a small ceremony. Mrs. Dorothea Ashby came from Derbyshire in a new bonnet that was, by universal agreement, an excellent bonnet, dark blue with a white trim, which suited her coloring very well, and which she had clearly purchased with some attention to the occasion. She cried during the ceremony, and again during the breakfast after, and then at the end of the breakfast said, to no one in particular, that she had always known something would come right, and that Nell had always had good judgment about people, and that she was going to go home now and plant the autumn bulbs. She did not go home. She accepted the offer of a cottage on the Thornville estate, at Aliner's suggestion and Crispin's immediate agreement, and she planted the autumn bulbs there, and the spring after that, and the spring after that, and has been doing so ever since. The children from the school attended the wedding in a group, scrubbed and solemn, and then not solemn at all once the ceremony was over. The girl who had waved from the doorway presented Aliner with a drawing she had made of the schoolhouse, which Aliner kept and hung in her sitting room at Thornville, where it remained for as long as I was a frequent visitor, which was a long time. Mrs. Fallow cried as well, and then denied having cried, and then poured herself a second glass of the wedding punch and declared it excellent. Crispin's aunt, Lady Cressida, arrived from Bath in considerable state, having heard of the wedding with enough advance notice to make the journey, and she wept more comprehensively than anyone, which surprised me, and then took Aliner's hands in both of hers and said something to her privately that I could not hear, but which made Aliner afterward look at Lady Cressida with an expression of genuine warmth. I was best man, as I said. I gave a toast in which I mentioned the Lancashire inquiry, the Stanhope vicar, the chalk specimens on the desk, and the Portuguese poetry, and I did not mention any of these things with apology, and the assembled company laughed at the parts I intended them to laugh at and was quiet at the parts I intended them to be quiet at. And when I finished, Crispin said, very quietly across the table, "Thank you, Hadley," and I said, "You're welcome," as I always did, and meant it more than I usually had occasion to. I want to say something about what London said, and then I want to be done with what London said, because what London said was, on the whole, not the point. They said that the Duke of Thornville had lost his reason. They said he had married beneath himself in a manner so complete as to be practically unprecedented. They said that the new Duchess had no family, no connections, no money, and had been, the phrase varied according to the narrator, but the substance was the same, employed in various households for the better part of a decade. They said this with varying degrees of disapproval and curiosity, and they said it, most of them, in rooms where neither Crispin nor Aliner was present. When the new Duchess appeared in London in the autumn of 1820, the rooms became rather more complicated. She appeared at 3 events that autumn. I was present at all 3. At the first, a dinner at Lord Wexmoor's, which was where Crispin had met the Countess of Harwick 4 years before, and which Lord Wexmoor clearly understood was a significant occasion, because he had laid on a particularly good claret. She was seated next to a woman named Lady Parrington, who was one of the keenest social arbiters of that particular season, and who was known, among other things, for a particular way of asking questions that made the questioned person feel as if they were being assessed for entry into somewhere better than where they currently were. Lady Parrington asked Aliner about her education. Aliner told her with complete directness about the schools she had taught at and the subjects she had taught, and about her interest in natural history, and about the survey of British flora that her father had given her before he died, which she had since used in 3 different school curricula to teach reading and observation simultaneously. Lady Parrington listened to all of this with an expression that moved, in the course of about 4 minutes, from assessment to recalibration to something that was not quite surprise, but was clearly not what she had anticipated. At the end of it, she said that she had always thought natural history was an undervalued subject in the education of young people, and Aliner said that she agreed entirely, and they then had a conversation about botanical illustration that excluded everyone else at that end of the table and lasted for 20 minutes. At the second event, a card party at someone's house I have now forgotten, the wife of a peer said something unkind within Aliner's hearing about the origins of her education, meaning to be overheard, because this is what the wife of this particular peer did when she wished to establish her position. Aliner turned toward her with a look of such complete composure and such absolute directness that the woman stopped talking in the middle of her own sentence, which I had not previously seen anyone achieve. Aliner said something very pleasantly that I will not reproduce here in full, which acknowledged the observation, corrected a factual error it contained, and concluded with a remark about the subject under discussion that was both accurate and amusing, and which the rest of the room heard and found funnier than the woman it was directed at did. The woman left early. Aliner played cards with excellent attention for the rest of the evening and won. At the third event, a gathering at Lady Cressida's London house, which Lady Cressida had arranged for the specific purpose of introducing Alina to the people whose opinions she judged to matter most. Lady Cressida herself made an attempt to establish whether Crispin and Alina were, in her estimation, properly settled, by which she meant whether Alina understood her position and was prepared to maintain it to Lady Cressida's satisfaction. Alina understood what was being asked. She received the inquiry with perfect pleasantness. She said that she and Crispin were entirely settled, that she was very grateful for Lady Cressida's interest, and that she was looking forward to coming to know Lady Cressida better over the coming years. She said this in a tone that was so warm and so final that Lady Cressida looked at her for 5 full seconds with the expression of a woman who has attempted to establish the boundaries of a thing, and found that the thing has already established its own boundaries, and that they are quite different from the ones she had in mind. Then Lady Cressida said, "Well, I see why he looked for so long." And Alina said, "I shall tell him you said so." And Lady Cressida patted her hand and told Crispin he had better take good care of her, which from Lady Cressida was practically a papal blessing. The natural philosopher at the third event, a man named Mr. Alcott, who was a fellow of a learned society, and who had written 2 papers on botanical taxonomy, was so startled to find a duchess who could discuss the finer points of Linnean classification with specific reference to recent developments in the field that he stood talking to her for most of an hour, and left the party in a state of considerable stimulation, and wrote Crispin a letter the following week asking whether the duchess might be interested in corresponding with the society, which she was. London, on the whole, recalibrated. Not entirely, and not without the usual forms of resistance that London deploys when it is required to recalibrate. There were people who continued to find the whole thing peculiar and said so, and there were people who decided that the Duke of Thornville had always been an eccentric, and this was simply the most visible evidence of it, and there were people who waited to see whether the Duchess would prove, over time, to be as formidable as her first 3 appearances suggested. She was. I will not account for all of it. The years that followed are their own story, and a long one, and not entirely mine to tell. I will say only a few things because they belong to the telling. She was, as he had glimpsed in those 8 minutes, entirely herself. This turned out to mean something rather large over time. She was quick and exacting and funnier than almost anyone I knew, which was not something most people expected of her before they knew her, and which they immediately understood after they did. She was serious about the things that mattered to her, which included the natural history of the north of England, the education of children in places that did not prioritize it, the proper identification of wildflowers, and this became clear gradually, and then very clear, the well-being of her husband, to whom she paid a quality of attention that I recognized, with some wonder, as the mirror image of the quality of attention he had always paid to her. She wrote to her mother every week without exception. She visited Derbyshire in the first autumn with Crispin, and I heard later from Crispin that Mrs. Dorothea Ashby had received them in her new cottage with a garden that was, by October, producing the best chrysanthemums in the county, and that she had served them tea and told Crispin, over the teacups, that she had always thought the steward's first inquiry was a hopeful sign, but that she'd had to be careful about saying so in case it came to nothing, and that she was glad it had come to something because Nell had always deserved something, and that was the end of that topic as far as she was concerned. Mrs. Dorothea Ashby, I want to say, was one of the people I met in those years who impressed me most. She had raised a daughter alone, in modest circumstances, on the edge of difficulty, and the daughter she had raised was Alina, which tells you a great deal about both of them. The school at Colburn was endowed by a deed that Alina drafted herself, with Crispin's solicitors, establishing a permanent position for a schoolmistress, a stipend, a library of natural history texts, and a set of requirements about the curriculum that were so specific and so clearly based on 9 years of teaching experience that the solicitors found them unexpectedly difficult to argue with and simply included them. The girl who had waved from the doorway went on, some years later, to take up the schoolmistress's position herself, which Alina regarded as entirely the correct outcome, and which made Mrs. Fallow, when she heard of it, very pleased. The wildflower competition, I mentioned it earlier, the game they played on horseback in the first autumn of their marriage, identifying species from a moving horse, became, over time, a tradition of the estate. I participated once and did adequately. My wife participated once and won comprehensively, which was characteristic of her, and which Alina found very satisfying. Crispin, over the years, won the wildflower competition twice, and lost it 4 times, and disputed the 2 he lost on methodological grounds. Alina disputed his disputation. They argued about it at considerable length and with great pleasure. I observed this argument on 2 occasions and found it, both times, the most entertainment I had had in months. I want to end on the thing that I have been turning toward since the beginning of this account, which is the question of what those 9 years meant. I asked Alina about this once, some years into the marriage, when we were walking in the Thornville Park in the autumn, and Crispin had gone ahead to look at something geological on the East Ridge. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was genuinely considering something rather than simply gathering the words for an answer she had ready. "I thought about him," she said. "Not often, I didn't let myself. But sometimes." She was looking at the ridge, at the distant figure of her husband crouching over what was presumably an interesting rock. "I thought, there was a man at the market who looked at the book in my basket and laughed when I said something about the Western Light and apples and was about to ask me something and then was called away. And I thought about what the question would have been." She paused. "I had the answer ready. For 9 years I had the answer ready." "Observation versus record," I said. "That direct observation is irreplaceable," she said, "but that the literature gives you the language to describe what you observe, and that without the language the observation is only half-formed. The best naturalists do both." She was still looking at the ridge. I had composed that answer in my head in October of 1810 for a question I thought he was about to ask. And then he was gone, and I carried the answer around for 9 years without anyone to give it to. She turned and looked at me. "When he came to Caldburn," she said, "and Mrs. Fallow told me what he said to her to give to me about the apples, I knew it was the same man, not because I had remembered his face particularly, but because the apples remark was the same kind of thing as the question I had expected. It was the same quality of attention. The same noticing." She paused. "That quality is not very common." "No," I agreed, "it is not." "I had been careful for a long time," she said. "About people, about letting people in and what that led to. I had learned to be careful." She looked at her hands, which had ink on them as usual. "I did not want to be careful with him." I did not say anything. "That was frightening," she said. "Not wanting to be careful. After 9 years of being careful, it was unfamiliar." "But you were not careful," I said. She looked at me with a quick, direct look. "No," she said, "I was not." A slight pause. "He was very honest about what he didn't know. He said he had been carrying a picture of me for 9 years and he didn't know if the picture and the person were the same, and he was asking me for the chance to find out. Not demanding, asking." She looked back at the ridge. I found that right." Crispin was coming back down the ridge now, picking his way with his characteristic deliberateness across the autumn turf. He saw us and raised one hand, briefly, in a gesture that was not quite a wave, but acknowledged us from a distance. Alina raised her hand back. It was such a small thing, a raised hand on an autumn morning across a field, and I watched it with a feeling I did not try to name, because it was the kind of feeling that doesn't need naming. It is enough to have seen it. It is enough to have been there from the beginning, and to have stayed through the middle, and to have been present at the arrival. He had looked for 10 years, he had found her. She had been composing an answer to his question for 9 years, and she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to give it to the person who had asked it. Not a ballroom, not a crowd, not a vindication before a shocked society. A schoolroom in April, a conversation about natural history. 2 people finding out in the most thorough possible way that the thing they had each been carrying for 9 years was real, and was theirs, and was, at last, somewhere to be set down. That is the whole of it. I have told it many times, as I said at the beginning. I will probably tell it again. It is the kind of story that improves with telling, not because the facts change, but because the listener, each time, finds a different part of it that matters to them and asks about that part. And you find yourself looking at it from a new angle and seeing something you had not quite seen before. The last time I told it, the person I told it to, my grandson, who is 12 and who had been listening with his chin in his hands, and a look of intense concentration, said, "But how did he know? How did he know she was worth looking for from only 8 minutes?" I thought about this for a long time, because it is the right question and also the hardest one. He didn't know, I said finally, not in the sense of certainty. He had a very clear observation of a very particular thing, and he trusted the observation, and he waited to see if the observation was right. I paused, and it was. My grandson considered this. What if it hadn't been? Then he would have been a man who spent 9 years looking for someone and arrived at the wrong answer, I said. But he trusted the observation, so he looked. Another pause. And the observation was right. My grandson thought about this for a while longer, and then said, I think I will go look at something very carefully before I decide about anything. Which is, I told him, exactly the right lesson to take from it. The Duke of Thornville, last I sat with him, which was a Tuesday not long past, in his library at Thornville, with the fire good and the claret excellent and the sound of a leaner somewhere in the east wing saying something to her mother about the autumn plantings, is 60 years old, and as quiet as he has ever been and not remotely incomplete. He is the most complete man I know. He was looking for 10 years for the part of himself that he had glimpsed in 8 minutes at a market in October. He found it, and the finding of it did not diminish what he found but revealed more of it, year after year, because that is what happens when you carry something true for a long time, and then arrive at the place it was always meant to go. I was there from the beginning. I am glad I was. That is the end of it and all of it, and exactly as it happened. I have been asked by various people over the years whether Crispin ever spoke to anyone else about the matter during those 9 years. Whether he had, as it were, a confessor, someone other than me with whom he shared the particular weight of the search. The answer is no, he did not. This tells you something about him. Most men, over the course of 9 years, accumulate confidants, people who know more than they ought, people to whom the truth leaks out in the wrong moment at the wrong dinner, people who are told directly because the pressure of not telling becomes intolerable. Crispin was not this kind of man. He had a capacity for containment that was not suppression. He did not push things down. He simply carried them very cleanly, in a space that was apparently quite large and quite well organized. And the number of people he actually confided in, on matters that were personal to him rather than professional, was very small. I was that number with a few exceptions. The exceptions were, first, his valet, a man named Toombs who had been with the Vane family since before Crispin's father died, and who knew everything that happened in the household simply by being present with the particular invisible attentiveness of very good valets. Toombs never spoke of the matter to me directly. But I observed, in the years of the inquiry, that he had developed a habit of laying out certain clothes when Crispin was about to go north or west on what I recognized as an inquiry trip. Clothes that were correct but not ostentatious. The clothes of a man who wishes to make a good impression without appearing to be trying to make a good impression. This required a degree of knowledge that Toombs could only have acquired from Crispin himself, and the precision with which it was done suggested a conversation of some length at some point. The second exception was Prentice, obviously, who knew the material facts of the search from the beginning, and who had conducted it with a thoroughness and a discretion that were, I think, not entirely explained by professional obligation. Prentice was not a sentimental man in any obvious sense, but he was a thorough one, and in the years I worked alongside him, or more precisely, alongside his reports, I saw in those reports a quality that exceeded what the mere performance of duty would have required. He wrote about the schoolchildren in Stanhope, for instance. He did not need to. The information that a Miss Eleanor had worked at the school was sufficient for the inquiry's purposes. But he wrote also that the schoolmaster had said she was unusually good with the children, that she had given one of them a book from her own collection, that the children had been sorry when she left. He put it in the report. He sent it to Crispin, who read it, and who did not comment on it to me directly, but who kept, I noticed, every report Prentice wrote in a folder in his desk that was distinct from all other estate correspondence. The folder was still in his desk at Thornville the last time I looked. I suspect it is there still. I mention these exceptions because they illuminate something about the way the matter was held over those years by the people who were close to it. It was not a secret exactly, or not a secret in the sense of something shameful or impossible. It was more like a private project of considerable importance, held at the appropriate level of privacy, known to those who needed to know it, unknown to those who didn't, and never in all the years I was aware of it, a subject of complaint or self-pity or drama. This was Crispin's quality above all others. He did not dramatize. He was experiencing something that in a different man would have become its own story, the lovelorn Duke, the hopeless search, the romantic obsession. He was not any of those things. He was a man who had seen something true and was trying to find it again, and who did not see this as remarkable because the alternative, abandoning the search and settling for something that was not true, struck him as so obviously worse that it wasn't worth discussing. I try to imagine him at 35, say, in the middle years of the search, standing in front of some gathering of eligible women at some London function, knowing what he knew about himself and the search and the particular quality of the thing he was looking for, and managing all of this with the composure that everyone who encountered him in those years invariably described. I have known him all my life, and I still find it extraordinary. But he would not find it extraordinary. He would find it simply what he was doing. Let me tell you about the autumn of 1816, because I think it is the autumn that shows most clearly what the search had become by its middle years. I went to Thornville in September of that year, after the London season had concluded and before the winter set in, which was a time I particularly liked. The estate at Thornville in early autumn had a quality of settled beauty that I found very agreeable, the light going golden through the trees and the fields cleared, and the air beginning to have the cold edge that would deepen as October came on. Crispin was in good form that September. He had completed, in the spring, a piece of work that had occupied him for 2 years, a survey of the Thornville estate accounts going back to his father's time, which had identified several inefficiencies and one fairly significant opportunity, and which had been received by his agent with the mixture of admiration and mild alarm that attends a very thorough document. He had handled the parliamentary business of the previous session with, by all accounts, his usual precision, and he had overseen the successful repair of the East Ridge fence that had been needing repair for 3 years. He was satisfied with these things in a business-like way, and the satisfaction was genuine. He was also, that September, reading a book about the migration patterns of British birds. I noticed it on his desk. It was a natural history text, and not just any natural history text. It was specifically a survey of the birds of northern England, with a chapter on the flora of the moorland regions and their relationship to bird habitation, and I recognized, when I saw it, the particular flavor of choosing that had produced it. He was not reading it because he had a sudden interest in birds. He was reading it because it was the kind of book she would have read. I did not say this, I simply noted it. In the evenings that September, after dinner, we played chess and talked in the way of people who have been friends long enough that the talking can be about anything or nothing, and the silence is also comfortable, and the whole evening has a particular easy quality that I believe is one of the things I will miss most when I am too old or too dead to experience it. On one of those evenings, Crispin said something that I have thought about often since. We had been talking about a letter he had received from the geologist at Oxford, a man named Marchland, who had become a friend over the course of several years' correspondence, who had written to say that he was going to be traveling through the north of England in the autumn and hoped to visit Thornville and examine the limestone formations. This was a prospect that Crispin regarded with what I can only describe as warm professional excitement, which was as close as he got to social eagerness. And then, in the middle of saying something about the specific feature of the East Ridge formation that Marchland would find most interesting, he stopped. Just stopped mid-sentence in a way that was not like him. I waited. She would have a view on the formations, he said. I did not ask who he meant. I said, what kind of view? A naturalist's view, he said. She would see them in relation to the flora, what grows on limestone versus what grows on the surrounding drift, how the botanical composition of the ridge differs from the valley. He paused. That is not Marchland's approach. Marchland is interested in the structure itself. She would be interested in what the structure produces. You don't know that, I said gently. No, he agreed. I don't. He was quiet for a moment. But she was looking at the flowers when I met her. She was interested in the flowers, and she had ink on her fingers, which means she had been writing. What does a woman write about when she is engaged with flowers and has a natural history text in her basket? She writes about what she observes. Another pause, so she would have a view. I accepted this. It was reasonable as inferences went, about as reasonable as any inference could be, built on as small a base as this one was. But I thought not for the first time that the specific quality of Crispin's knowledge of her, incomplete, fragmentary, built from the thinnest possible observation, was not actually as thin as it should have been, given how little he had to build on. He had gotten more from those 8 minutes than he should have been able to get. This was not magic. It was attention. He had been paying the particular quality of attention to her that he paid to everything that mattered to him, and the result was a picture that, while incomplete, was accurate in the ways that mattered. Whether it would prove accurate when matched against the reality of her 9 years later, that was still to be determined. But it was not nothing. I did not say any of this, because the moment was not one for analysis. I simply refilled the chess clock and let him move. He won that game in 17 moves, which told me he was thinking about something else. Let me also tell you about the spring of 1819, which was the year I came closest to saying something that would have been true and also, I think, not helpful. The second false lead of that year, the Miss E. Ashby of the West Country, who was not the right one, came in April, and when Prentice's letter arrived confirming the mismatch, Crispin read it in the library and then set it down and looked at the window in a way that was entirely still, for a longer time than was ordinary. I was there, I watched, I said nothing. After a while he said, 9 years. I said, yes. He said, it is possible she cannot be found. I said, it is possible. He said, it is also possible she is somewhere very ordinary, and the inquiry has simply not reached the right person yet. I said, also possible. He looked at me. Which do you think? I thought about this carefully because he was asking me seriously, and the careful answer and the kind answer were on this occasion the same answer, and I was glad of it. I think the second, I said. England is a large country. She has moved several times. The inquiry is working on the edges of a network that has significant gaps in it. The probability that the right connection simply has not yet been made is much higher than the probability that she has become genuinely unfindable. I paused. But I will not pretend certainty. No, he said, don't pretend certainty. He looked back at the window. I would rather not have certainty that is wrong than uncertainty that is right. You never have, I said. He accepted this. And then he said something else, which I have thought about a great deal since. If I do not find her, he said, I will still have looked, and the looking will have told me something about what I am capable of wanting and what I am capable of doing when I want it. That is not nothing. I looked at him carefully. That is the opposite of nothing, I said. He nodded once. Yes, he said, I know. And then we played chess, and he won, and I went to bed, and in the morning the inquiry was still ongoing, and we did not speak of it again for some weeks. I want to tell you about one more thing from the middle years, because it is something I have not mentioned and which I believe deserves mention. In the summer of 1815, some months after Crispin returned from Portugal, I was at Thornville for a fortnight in August. It was a warm summer, one of the warmest I remember from those years, and the estate was at its best, the gardens full and the woods deep and the light long and golden in the evenings. On the second Tuesday of my stay, we rode the estate in the morning and came back through the South Meadow, which was the way that took you past the old orchard. The orchard at Thornville was not formally tended. It had been allowed to grow in its own direction for several decades, and the result was the kind of orchard that is not particularly productive but is very beautiful, with old apple trees of several varieties that had been there long enough to have personalities, and long grass under them. And in August, the smell of windfalls lying in the warmth. We slowed the horses, as we usually did in the orchard, because there was no particular reason to hurry through it. And Crispin said, looking at the trees, she would know the varieties. This was not unusual by that point. He made remarks like this occasionally, in the natural course of things, in places that suggested them. She would have a view on the limestone. She would know the varieties. She would have read this book. I had come to understand them as the audible trace of something that was always present in him, a kind of permanent, quiet conversation he was having with someone who was not there. But he said it differently this time. He said it with a quality of contentment that I had not heard before. Do you think so? I said. She was selling flowers at a market that also sold apples. She would have been there many times before. It was a weekly market. Prentice established that. She would know what the trees produced. She would know the varieties. He looked at the nearest tree, which was an old Ribston pippin. I recognized it by the shape of the fruit beginning to form in the branches. She might even have told me if I had asked. Asked about the apples. Asked about anything. She had opinions. He turned his horse slowly toward the next tree. The western light making the apples look better than they were, that is a naturalist's observation. She had been watching the market. She had been paying attention to what makes things look one way versus the way they actually are. He paused. I should have asked her about the orchard. I said, perhaps you will one day. He looked at me. Perhaps, he said. He said it with the contentment still in his voice. Not hope exactly. Hope had a feverish quality that was not present here. Something quieter. The contentment of a man who has made a long plan and is at peace with the length of it, not because the length is comfortable, but because the plan is right. We rode on through the orchard. The sunlight came through the apple trees in the particular dappled way that apple trees produce in summer, the light broken and reformed and broken again as the leaves moved, and the windfalls lay in the long grass, and the Ribston pippin leaned at its particular angle, and the whole orchard had the quality, this is not quite right, but it is the nearest I can get of a place that has been waiting for something without knowing it was waiting. I did not say this to Crispin. I thought it was possible that he would find it excessive, and I thought it was also possible that he already knew it, and neither possibility seemed to require me to speak. We came out of the orchard and rode on toward the house. That was the summer of 1815. 5 years later, I stood in that orchard with Alina on a morning in September of the first year of their marriage, and she stopped in front of the Ribston pippin and said, "What variety is this? The shape of the fruit is unusual." I told her. She looked at the tree for a moment with the focused attention she gave to natural things. "It's a very old tree," she said. "The graft line is almost invisible. It must have been put in 50 years ago at least." She reached up and turned one of the forming fruits in her hand, not picking it, just turning it to look at the color. "It will be ready in October." She let it go. "It will be excellent." She looked at me. "He said you would know the varieties," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those quick, light eyes. "When did he say that?" 5 years ago, I said. "When he was riding through here in August, he said you would know the varieties." She was quiet for a moment. "He was right," she said. And then we walked on, and the morning light came through the apple trees the way it always had, and the Ribston pippin leaned at its particular angle, and the orchard was the same as it had always been, and also, in some way I could not precisely define, complete. Now, I want to say something about what happened in the schoolroom in Caldburn, in the 2 hours between Crispin's arrival and his return to the inn, which I know partly from what he told me, and partly from what she told me later, and partly from what can be inferred from the combined picture they give. The schoolhouse was a single large room with long north-facing windows and a small fireplace that had been lit against the April chill. The desks were children's desks, low and solid, arranged in rows. The blackboard bore, in a clear and excellent hand, a list of the counties of northern England with their principal rivers. Alina had been teaching geography that morning. She was standing at the front of the room when he came in, and he said later that the first thing he noticed was that she was standing with a kind of composed attention that was the same quality he had noticed at the market, which was not the composure of a person who has arranged themselves for a meeting, but the composure of a person who is simply themselves. He said also that the room smelled of chalk and of the morning's fire, and that on the edge of the teacher's desk was a mug of tea that had gone cold, and that the sleeve of her gray dress had a small ink mark on it, near the cuff, from the geography lesson. He noticed the ink mark because he noticed things, and he noticed it with the particular feeling of a man who has been told something a long time ago that he was right about, and who has arrived, at last, at the evidence. "Your Grace," she said. He came further into the room. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I am very sorry to have kept you waiting." She looked at him with the directness he had remembered. "I was not aware," she said, "that we had an appointment." "No," he agreed, "I meant in general." She tilted her head slightly, in the manner of someone considering something and finding it worth considering. "You have been looking for me for 9 years," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes. Mrs. Fallow told me about the letter." She crossed her arms, not defensively, she told me later, but in the way she crossed her arms when she was thinking carefully and needed her hands occupied. "You said you wished to make me an offer of marriage." "Yes. You knew me for 8 minutes." "I know." You've been looking for me for 9 years on the basis of 8 minutes. Yes. He said later that he had expected some version of this, the audit of the facts, stated plainly, because she was the kind of person who stated things plainly, and that he had no response to it that was not the same statement of the same facts, which were, yes, 8 minutes, yes, 9 years, yes, he knew. This was what it was. There was no better way to say it. She looked at him for a long moment. He stood still and let her look because there was nothing to add, and because everything he was doing, standing in a schoolroom in Northumberland in April 1820, having spent the better part of a decade following a cold trail across several English counties, was itself the argument, and adding words to it would only diminish it. "What," she said at last, "did you notice about me at the market?" He told her. The ink, the laugh, the book under the flowers, the natural history text, the way she had spoken to him without any of the particular self-effacement that most people of her position deployed in the presence of a man of his. She listened to all of it. She was quiet afterward for a moment. "The book," she said, "was a survey of British flora. My father gave it to me before he died." "Yes," he said, "I know, the vicar in Stanhope mentioned it." Something moved in her face at that. "You went to Stanhope yourself?" she said. "In 1818. Before that, Derbyshire, Yorkshire, Lancashire." She uncrossed her arms. "You're telling me you came to Stanhope in 1818, and I had left in December of the year before." "By approximately 4 months, yes. And before Stanhope, there were inquiries in Yorkshire and Lancashire, and Derbyshire, and several county papers." "How many years before you had my full name?" 7. She stared at him. This was, he said, the only moment in that first conversation when she appeared genuinely unsettled. Not upset, not alarmed, but genuinely recalibrating, the way you recalibrate when you receive information that requires you to revise your understanding of something fundamental. "Why?" she said. It was the simplest question, and the one he had been most afraid of, because there was no simple answer that didn't sound either excessive or insufficient, and he had known this for 9 years, and had been turning over various ways to answer it for most of that time without finding one that was exactly right. But the woman standing in front of him was not the audience for a constructed answer. She was the kind of person who would hear a constructed answer and know it was constructed, and that would be worse than any answer he could give. So he gave the true one. "Because I spoke to you for 8 minutes, he said, "and in those 8 minutes you were entirely yourself, not a self arranged for the occasion, not adjusted for my presence or my position. You said what you observed about the apples, the western light, the relationship between prominence and quality, as if it were simply true because it was simply true without any apparent calculation of how it would land." A pause. "I have been in my position, in my circumstances, rather starved of that. I did not know how starved until I encountered it. I knew afterward." She was very still. "I might have been entirely other," she said. "Since then, people are not the same at 30 as they are at 20. I know. The person you have been looking for might not be who you found. I am aware of that. It is why I asked, through Mrs. Fallow, only to speak with you. You are under no obligation to be anything in particular." She looked at him for a very long time. She was thinking about what he had said, she told me later. She was thinking you were entirely yourself. She had been told in 9 years many things about what she was and what she should be, and none of those things had been that, and she understood what it meant for someone to say it, and she understood what it meant that the person saying it was not a woman she had taught or a clergyman she had impressed, but the man who had made a remark about apples that she had found genuinely funny 10 years ago, and who had apparently been carrying the memory of that remark, and everything that surrounded it. "Ever since." "I remember you," she said. Something moved in his face. "The apples," she said. "The inverse relationship between prominence and quality. I had not heard it put exactly that way." It made me laugh because it was true, and I had not thought of it precisely like that. She paused. "I was going to say something about the natural light, that the western stalls were always depleted by midday because the morning sun hit them directly and made everything look better than it was. I was going to say that the best produce was always in the shade." She stopped. "And then you were called away." "Yes," he said. "I thought about it afterward," she said. "Several times over the years, the conversation we were about to have." He said very quietly, "What were we about to have?" You were going to ask me about the book. I could tell. You looked at it the way people look at things when they intend to ask about them. She was looking at him steadily. I had the answer ready. He looked at her with an expression, she said, she found very difficult to interpret, because it was not one she had seen before, and she had by then seen a great many expressions on a great many people, and this one was new. What was the answer? He said. That direct observation is irreplaceable, she said. But the literature gives you the language to describe what you observe, and without the language the observation is only half-formed. The best naturalists do both. A pause. Yes, he said. He was looking at her in the way of a man who has just heard something he already knew and finds the confirmation of it the most complete and satisfying experience of a long period. That is exactly right. She looked at him. You knew that? I had 9 years to think about what you were likely to say. She laughed. It was the same laugh. He told me this afterward, and I believed him absolutely. Not because laughs cannot change in 9 years, they can and do, but because the quality of a genuine laugh, when it is genuinely someone's, does not alter in that particular direction. It comes from the same place it always came from, and he knew the place. After that they talked. He told me later that the 2 hours felt shorter and also longer than any 2 hours he could remember. Shorter because nothing in them felt like passing time, and longer because they covered more ground than he had covered in many longer conversations. They argued about observation versus record in natural history. He took the wrong side deliberately. He told me this with a slight expression of sheepishness, which was as close to sheepishness as he got, because he wanted to see how she argued, and she argued exactly as he had expected her to argue, which was thoroughly and without any of the qualification that a woman arguing with a duke might have deployed. She told him he was wrong. He agreed eventually. She said he had agreed too slowly. He said he had been considering all the evidence. She said there was no evidence that needed considering. He said the evidence was her making the argument. She gave him a look of very specific exasperation that he found entirely satisfying, and he said so. She said, "You are going to be an extremely inconvenient person to disagree with." He said, "On the contrary, I am simply thorough." She said, "That is what every inconvenient person says." He said, "And is generally true." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're funny." He looked startled. She said she found this very funny. He said he was not aware of being funny. She said that was part of it. He said he didn't see how that could be. She said it was because genuinely funny people don't know when they're being funny. They simply say the accurate thing, and the accurate thing is sometimes funny, and that was exactly what he did. He processed this. He said, "Is that what I did at the market?" About the apples, she said, "Yes. That was the accurate thing." You laughed, he said. It was funny, she said, because it was true, and because you said it as if you had just observed it for the first time, even though it must have been obvious to anyone who had ever been to a market. I had not often been to markets, he said, with the composure of a man who is aware that this makes him sound rarefied and is prepared to acknowledge it. No, she said, I gathered. There was a pause. I have been to rather more markets, he said, in the past 9 years in the course of looking. She looked at him. Markets. Various, several in Derbyshire, some in Yorkshire, 1 or 2 in Lancashire. A pause. I found the observation about apples continued to hold. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who is trying not to smile and is not entirely succeeding. You observed markets, she said, for 9 years. Among other things. And the best produce, he said, is always at the end of the row in the shade. She smiled. It was, he said, a very particular smile, not the laugh, something quieter and more private, the smile of a person who has received something that confirms something they already knew. After the argument about natural history and the conversation about markets, she said, I want to know what you have been doing, in the years, the inquiry aside, the rest of it. So he told her about the estates, he told her about the limestone. He told her about Marchland's visit in 1816 and the counter-argument about the formation that had produced a correspondence of 18 months. He told her about Portugal and what Portugal looked like from the inside and the book of Portuguese poetry that he had brought back and that was still on his shelf. He told her about the parliamentary work, which he described with the particular combination of competence and resignation that he always brought to parliamentary work. He told her about my jackdaws, which she found very funny. He told her about the chess games, which she asked about in some detail and on which she had opinions. He told her about the apple orchard at Thornville and the Ribston Pippin, and that he had thought, in the summer of 1815, that she would know the variety. She was quiet when he said this. "You were riding through your orchard in 1815, she said, "and you thought about what I would say." "Yes." "About apples." "About the variety," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. "I would have known it," she said. "I know," he said. And then he asked her to marry him, in the way I have described, directly, with the full acknowledgement of everything he didn't know, and the full weight of everything he did, and the complete and unconditional offer to find out whether the 9 years of carrying had arrived at the right place. And she said she would write to her mother, and she would think, and she asked him to come back in a fortnight. And he went and came back, and she said yes. I will add one more thing, which is the conversation I had with Alina on the first anniversary of their marriage, which was a warm June evening, and they had dinner with me and my wife at our house in the country. And afterward, Crispin and my wife had gone into the garden to look at something in the garden that I have now forgotten. And Alina and I were sitting in the drawing room with the last of the evening light coming in from the west. She said, "May I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. "When did you know he was serious, that it was not a passing thing?" I thought about this, the library in November 1810, the claret, the precision with which he had established the elapsed time. "The night he told me," I said. He counted backward from the courier's arrival to establish how long he had spoken to you. 8 minutes. He had done the calculation in his head afterward. She looked at me. He calculated it. "From the courier's known journey time," I paused. "That is when I knew." She was quiet for a moment. "He is," she said, "a very precise person." "He is," I agreed. "It is one of the things," she stopped, started again. "When I met him in Caldburn, the first thing I noticed was that he was exactly as precise in person as the letter to Mrs. Fallow suggested he would be. The letter was very careful, very exact about what he did and didn't know, what he was asking and what he wasn't asking." She paused. "I trust people who are exact about what they don't know." "Most people prefer to present certainty," I said. "Yes," she said, "and then the certainty fails and you are left with whatever the failure was." She looked at her hands. "He didn't pretend to certainty about me. He had 9 years of looking, and he was still very clear that he didn't know whether what he had been looking for was what he found." "Was it?" I said. She looked up. "Yes," she said, simply, directly, in the same tone he had used when he confirmed that the observation about apples had held over 9 years of markets. "And more," she said. And the last of the evening light came in from the west, and somewhere in the garden, my wife was saying something about the state of the roses, and Crispin was responding with the engaged attention he gave to all things, and the summer evening was long and warm, and everything was exactly as it should be. That is now truly the whole of it. Let me tell you about the letters. I do not mean the letters Prentice wrote and Crispin received. Those I have already described, and they were, as I said, thorough and careful. I mean a different set of letters, which I did not know about until several years into the marriage, when Alina mentioned them in a way that made it clear she assumed I already knew. She had been writing to him. Not during the search, she had not known about the search, and she had not known who he was until 1820. But after the meeting in Caldburn, in the fortnight between his visit and her answer, and then in the weeks between her answer and the wedding, she had written to him. And he had written back. And the correspondence that resulted was, by her account, an entirely different kind of communication from any either of them had previously conducted. I gathered this not from her description of the letters themselves, but from the way she described what the correspondence had felt like, which she said was like finding out that two people who had established the outlines of something significant in a single meeting were actually capable of filling in the outlines, at length and in detail, in writing, without the outlines becoming less significant in the process. She said most correspondences diminish what they started from. The meeting is the thing, and the letters are the echo of the meeting, and the echo gets smaller. She paused. These didn't. "What did you write about?" I asked. "Everything," she said. She was looking at the window, the way she sometimes looked at the window when she was recalling something she found pleasant to recall. Natural history, his geological work, the school, the children in the school, the books we were both reading. We were reading different things, and we described them to each other, and then we argued about them by letter at length. A pause. He wrote about the orchard. The Ribston Pippin. She looked at me. You told me about that. He told me, I said, in the summer of 1815. He wrote about it, she said, in the letter after the first visit. He said he had been in the orchard that morning and the Ribston Pippin was setting fruit, and that he had thought about what I would say about the variety, and that he had found the thought he used the word settled. He said it felt settled, thinking about what I would say, and then imagining what I would actually say, now that he knew me rather better than he had known me in the summer of 1815. She paused. He wrote rather beautifully, as it happens. I thought about this. I had known Crispin for 4 decades, and I had received, over that time, a significant quantity of correspondence from him, and I could confirm that he wrote very well, precisely, and with an economy that gave each word more weight than a more abundant writer would have. But I had not received letters of the kind she was describing, because the kind she was describing required something I was not, which was the person he had spent 9 years looking for. Do you still have them? I asked. All of them, she said. She said it simply without any self-consciousness about the fact. Then, he has mine as well. Has he said anything about them? She smiled, the private one, the one that came from a particular place. He said they were the most accurate things he had ever read about anything. I thought that was, for Crispin, the highest possible compliment, and that she knew exactly what it meant. I want to tell you about the first evening I spent with both of them together at Thornville, after the marriage. They had returned from a wedding trip. They had gone to Scotland, which Crispin had proposed because Elinor had never been there and he thought she would find the botany interesting, which she did, in late July of 1820, and they were settling into the house, which was something I watched with great attention because a house settling around a new person is one of the more revealing processes I know. What I observed was this: Elinor did not change Thornville, and Thornville did not resist her. She moved through it with the same composed attention she brought to everything, looking at things carefully and asking about them when she wanted to know. And the house, which had been, for all the years of my acquaintance with it, extremely correct and somewhat cold, in the way of a house that is very well managed but not particularly lived in, began, gradually and without drama, to feel different. The first change I noticed was in the library. She had unpacked her books. She had 3 boxes of them, which Crispin received with what I can only describe as deep approval, and they were on a section of the shelving that had previously held a set of rather dull estate histories from the previous century, which she relocated to the upper shelves. Her books were natural history texts, botanical surveys, a selection of geological works she had read partly because Crispin was interested in geology, and she wanted to follow the subject, 3 volumes of poetry she had accumulated over the years, a set of mathematical texts she had used for teaching, and the survey of British flora that her father had given her, which had a cover that was considerably worn from long use and which she placed without comment on the shelf at eye level, where it remained. The second change was in the garden. Mrs. Dorothea Ashby came to Thornville in August, and within the first week she and Elinor had walked the kitchen garden and the walled garden and the south border and had developed opinions about all of them. Crispin's head gardener, a man named Brabbins who had been with the estate for 20 years and had very settled opinions about his gardens, received these opinions with the expression of a man who is prepared to resist new ideas, encountered Elinor's particular quality of quiet competence, and was subsequently seen, within the fortnight, following her suggestion about the placement of the autumn bulbs with the expression of a man who has discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that a new idea was in fact correct. The third change was at dinner. Dinner at Thornville in the years before the marriage was a very correct and rather quiet affair. Crispin dined when he was there, was courteous to whatever guests were present, and then retired to the library, and the evening had the general quality of a well-run machine. Dinner after the marriage was different, not louder, not more elaborate, but different in quality. Elinor asked questions. Not the questions that people ask at dinner as a social form, but actual questions, the kind that require actual answers, and that produce, in response to the answer, further questions, and a conversation that goes somewhere rather than simply performing the ritual of going somewhere. The first dinner I had with them at Thornville that autumn, it was October, the light already going early, the fire good in the dining room. She asked me, at some point in the middle of the meal, what I had thought, the first time Crispin told me about the woman at the market. I said I had thought it was a condition rather than a mood. She looked at me. What's the difference? A mood passes, I said. A condition is structural. It describes how the person is built, not how they happen to be feeling. She considered this, and you knew immediately. When he told me he had calculated the elapsed time from the courier's arrival, I said, yes. She turned to Crispin. You calculated it. I told Hadley that already, he said. I know, she said. I wanted to hear you say it. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has recently discovered that a woman can find precision endearing, and who finds this development both unexpected and entirely satisfying. Yes, he said. I calculated it. 8 minutes. 8 minutes and, I estimated, 40 seconds, but I gave it 8 minutes in the round. She looked at me. 8 minutes and 40 seconds. He is thorough, I said. He is, she agreed. And then she asked Crispin something about the limestone formations on the East Ridge, and he answered with the concentrated attention he gave to all things, and she listened with the same attention, and I sat at the dinner table in the dining room at Thornville and ate an excellent meal and watched two people having a conversation that was a continuation of all the conversations they were always going to have, and thought, yes, that is exactly right. I said earlier that London recalibrated. I want to say something more about what recalibrating looked like, in the specific case of the Duke and Duchess of Thornville, because I think it illustrates something important about the kind of people they were and the kind of marriage they had. The ton, in general, expected a certain performance from a Duke and Duchess. The performance included appearing at the right events in the right order, wearing the right things, being seen in the right places, conducting the right conversations with the right people, and generating, in the aggregate, the impression of a household that was socially significant and correctly managed. This performance was not dishonest, exactly, but it was a performance, and it was expected, and the question of whether a new Duchess would be capable of performing it was one that the ton considered carefully and with some anxiety in the case of a Duchess who had come, as Elinor had, from outside the usual pool of candidates. Elinor was capable of the performance. This was what surprised people, I think, more than anything else. They expected either inability, a schoolmistress overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of Ducal's social life, or refusal, a woman of unconventional background who refused to engage with convention. Elinor produced neither. She understood the performance, and she could produce it when it was required, and she did, and she produced it well. But she did not find it interesting, and she did not permit it to be the primary mode of her engagement with the world, and the people who were paying close attention to her noticed, in time, that the performance was always clearly distinguishable from the actual person, in the way that a well-played instrument is distinguishable from the musician's own voice. Her actual voice, when she used it, was, as I have tried to describe, entirely hers. And it was, I found over the years, the thing that people most remembered afterward. They remembered what she said rather than what she wore, which is not the usual testimony of the ton, and they remembered it because she said actual things rather than performative things, and actual things stick in the mind differently. The Botanical Society correspondence that began with Mr. Alcott in the autumn of 1820 produced, over the following years, several published papers to which Elinor contributed notes and observations. These were published under her married name, which caused some comment in certain quarters, because duchesses did not generally publish in botanical journals, and the comment produced a letter from one such quarter to Crispin, inquiring delicately whether he was aware of his wife's activities. He wrote back. The letter was not long. It said that, yes, he was aware, and that he had in fact read the most recent paper and found it excellent, and that if the correspondent had a specific concern about its accuracy, he would be glad to pass the concern along. No further letters were received on that subject. I want to say, now, something about Elinor's mother that I have not yet said, because Mrs. Dorothea Ashby was a woman who deserves more than the few mentions she has received in this account. She came to Thornville in August of 1820, as I have said, with the new bonnet and a quantity of bulbs that she had brought from her Derbyshire garden on the grounds that the Thornville south border was deficient in certain species, and she intended to remedy this. She settled into her cottage at the edge of the home farm with the complete competence of a woman who has lived in one kind of place for 40 years and understands very well how to make another kind of place livable. She was not, in any obvious sense, what you would call an impressive woman. She was ordinary in the way that genuinely good people are often ordinary. She did not call attention to herself. She did not have strong opinions about her own importance. She did not perform either her virtues or her difficulties. She grew excellent flowers. She kept her cottage in very good order. She was kind to everyone in the household and the village, and was kind in the way of women who are kind because it is what they are rather than because they have decided to be kind. She told me one afternoon in her garden, when we were doing what she called putting the south bed to rights, and what I was mainly doing was handing her things and not getting in the way, that she had known, when Crispin's steward first came to the village with inquiries, that there was something in it. How? I asked. She sat back on her heels and looked at the bulbs she had just planted. Because Nell never told me why he had come, she said. She just said someone was asking about her and she didn't want to talk about it, and I should say I didn't know where she'd gone, which I did say. She paused. But Nell never not told me things unless the thing was something she wanted to protect. She protected it because she thought it might be something. She looked at me. I didn't know it was a duke. What did you think it was? A man who had met her and been struck by her and was trying to find out who she was. She returned to her bulbs. I didn't know it would take 9 years. I thought it would take less. She had moved several times, I said. She had, Mrs. Ashby agreed. For various reasons. She did not elaborate on the reasons, and I did not ask. But I always thought if the man was serious, he would eventually find her. Men who are serious about things generally do. I thought about this. You had a great deal of faith in a man you had never met. I had a great deal of faith in Nell's instincts, she said. If she was protecting it, it was worth protecting. She patted the earth over the last of the bulbs and stood up, brushing her hands on her skirt. She has very good instincts. She always did about people. She did not know he was a duke, I said, when she met him. No, Mrs. Ashby agreed, which is probably why her instincts worked properly. This is the most acute observation anyone made about the situation. In all the years I knew it. Mrs. Dorothea Ashby, putting in the south border of her cottage garden in September 1820, identified the central dynamic with a precision that would have taken most people considerably longer to formulate. Nell had not adjusted for his presence at the market because she had not known what his presence was, and he had noticed exactly this. And the 10 years that followed were, at bottom, the consequence of that one uncalibrated encounter, the one conversation he had had in 10 years of social life, in which the person he was speaking to had not known what adjustments to make, and so had simply been herself, and he had recognized the quality of that and had not been able to put it down. Mrs. Ashby cut some chrysanthemums from the bed and handed them to me to carry. She chose well, she said, in the tone of a woman closing a topic she is satisfied with. Yes, I agreed. So did he, she added, as a concession to completeness. I carried the chrysanthemums back to the cottage. They were excellent chrysanthemums, the best in the county. The new bonnet had been entirely correct. I have one more thing to say, and then I will stop. In the winter of 1821, Crispin and Alina were at Thornville, and I was staying for the week before Christmas, and there was snow, the first heavy snow of that winter, the kind that comes in the night and remakes the landscape by morning. I came downstairs early, because I am a man who wakes early regardless of season, and I found the library empty but warm, the fire already made up by someone, and the morning light coming through the windows in the particular white-reflected way that means snow outside. I went to the window. The Thornville Park in the snow was very beautiful. The trees were frosted, and the long grass was buried, and the ground was unbroken white in every direction, and the light was the flat, even light of a heavy overcast reflecting off the snow, and everything was very still. They were in the orchard. I could see them from the library window, at the far edge of the kitchen garden, and then in among the apple trees. They were both wrapped against the cold, Crispin in the dark coat I recognized, Alina in a blue wool cloak, and they were walking slowly through the orchard, stopping every few trees. I could not hear them. I could see them at this distance as two figures in a white and gray landscape, moving between the apple trees and stopping, and one of them saying something, I thought it was a leaner, and the other one looking at whatever she was pointing at, and then both of them looking at the tree together for a moment. They were, I realized, identifying the varieties. In the snow. In the early morning before breakfast, before anyone else was awake, they had gone out into the orchard and they were going through the apple trees and identifying the varieties. I stood at the library window and watched them for a long time. He had thought in the summer of 1815 that she would know the varieties. He had been right. And now, in the winter of 1821, they were in the orchard together in the snow, going from tree to tree, and she was telling him which was which, and he was listening, and the whole orchard was theirs, and the snow was still, and the morning was very quiet. That is now, truly, completely, and exactly the whole of it. I was there from the beginning. I have been there through all of it. I am glad every time I think of it that I was. He saw her only once at the market. He spent 10 years searching for her name. And what he found at the end of 10 years was not simply the name, and not simply the woman, but the complete and confirmed and fully realized truth of what he had seen in 8 minutes at Brentwood Cross in the October of 1810. That she was, precisely and permanently, the person he had thought. That the observation had been correct. That the 10 years had been the time required to arrive at the place where the observation could be verified, and having been verified, held. That the orchard in the snow, and the chrysanthemums in the south border, and the ink on her fingers at the geography lesson, and the argument about observation versus record, and the letter about the Ribston Pippin, and Mrs. Fallow crying at the wedding, and the girl who waved from the doorway, and the botanical society papers, and the chess games, and the wildflower competition. And every morning since April of 1820, when two people in a house in Derbyshire have woken up and found each other there. All of it was the 8 minutes at the market, extended into the full length and breadth of a life. That is what love looks like when it is right. Not a drama, not a rescue, not a reversal before a shocked society. Simply attention, paid with complete accuracy over a long time to something true. And the finding, at last, of the place where that attention was welcome. I want to go back to the years of the middle of the search, because I have given you the outline of them and not the texture, and the texture matters. The texture was this. Crispin Vane continued in those years to be one of the most fully functioning people I knew. I mean this not as a compliment, particularly, although it is one, but as an observation about the nature of the search and how he held it. There is a version of this story in which a man looks for a woman for 10 years, and the looking becomes the dominant feature of his existence. He becomes the search. He is defined by it. Everything else is secondary. He is dimmed or diminished or hollowed by the absence of the thing he is looking for. This is the romantic version, and I understand why people prefer it. It is not what happened. What happened was that Crispin Vane managed his estates very thoroughly, corresponded with his solicitors and his geologist and his parliamentary contacts with perfect reliability, attended to his parliamentary duties with the focused precision he brought to any obligation, pursued his geological interests with genuine and increasing sophistication, kept the Thornville household in excellent order, was courteous to everyone he dealt with, and kind to the people he was responsible for, and beat me at chess with a consistency that I found both admirable and somewhat dispiriting. He also, alongside all of that, carried the knowledge that he had met someone once briefly and had not gotten her name, and he maintained an inquiry into her whereabouts with the same methodical attention he gave to everything else. The search was not consuming him. It was simply there, like the limestone formation on the East Ridge, a feature of the landscape that he was interested in and attentive to without it being the only feature. I think this is why he was able to keep looking. A man consumed by a search eventually produces heat that burns out. A man who carries something as part of the general structure of his existence, without forcing it to be the whole of the structure, can carry it indefinitely. He was also, it must be said, the kind of man who does not give up on things he has decided are worth doing, which is a character trait that can be irritating in minor matters and very useful in major ones. The years had a rhythm to them. Autumn at Thornville, winter, some of it in London for parliamentary purposes, spring back to Thornville and the limestone and the East Ridge and the account books. Summer, which was the best part, the long evenings, the fields, the rides through the estate, the evenings in the library. Occasionally a journey to London for an extended period, once to Scotland for a land matter, once to Portugal, once to several northern counties in pursuit of a lead that came to nothing. In the rhythm of those years, the inquiry had its own rhythm. Prentice sent reports, sometimes monthly, sometimes less often when there was less to report. Crispin read the reports and sent back instructions for the next stage. Occasionally he went himself. The Stanhope visit was the most significant of these, but there were others, smaller, briefer, that I only learned about after the fact. I learned about one of them in the autumn of 1817, when he mentioned, in passing, that he had been to Leeds the previous month to follow a lead about a women's education society that might have placed a leaner in a position in the north of England. "You went to Leeds," I said. "Yes. You did not tell me. You were in the country with your wife and the new baby," he said. "I did not think it required an announcement." "Did you find anything?" "No, pause. The society had records of a Miss E. Ashby of Derbyshire who had written to them in 1813, inquiring about positions. They had no record of her placing." I absorbed this. A letter from 1813, 4 years old at the time of the inquiry. Crispin going to Leeds himself in the autumn of 1817 to follow a 4-year-old letter that might or might not connect to a woman he had known for 8 minutes in 1810. "You went to Leeds," I said again. "It was not very far," he said, in the tone of a man explaining that a minor exertion was not an exertion. "Crispin." "Yes." "It is entirely reasonable," I said, "that you went to Leeds." He looked at me with the slight expression of a man who has been braced for argument and received agreement instead. "Yes," he said. "I thought so." We moved on to other subjects, but I noted it, and the noting of it became part of my understanding of the thing, that he was, quietly and without drama, going to whatever length the inquiry required, not because the going was dramatic, but because it was the appropriate response to the information available. He went to Leeds for a letter from 1813. He went to Stanhope in 1818 and arrived 4 months late. He wrote to Mrs. Fallow in Northumberland with a letter of such careful and complete honesty about his situation that she chose, on the basis of the letter alone, to communicate it to the woman she was protecting. These were not the actions of a man who was performing a search. They were the actions of a man who understood that thoroughness was what the situation required, and that the situation was important enough to deserve it. Let me tell you about a day in the spring of 1814 that I have thought of often. We were riding the north boundary of the estate, Crispin and I, in the particular clear light of an April morning when the air is cold, but the sun is high, and everything has a quality of just-washed brightness. The north boundary ran along a ridge, not the east ridge with the limestone formations, but the north one, which was mostly open moorland, and from which you could see, on a clear day, a very long way. It was a clear day. Crispin stopped his horse at the top of the ridge and looked north. I stopped beside him. The view went for miles, the moorland falling away in front of us, and then the valley, and then more hills, and then, on the very edge of visibility, the beginning of what I thought was the high ground of the Yorkshire Dales. He looked north for a long time. "She's north of here," he said. It was not the first time he had said something like this, but it was the first time he had said it with that particular quality, not hope, exactly, and not certainty, but something between the two that was harder to name. A directional sense, perhaps, the feeling of a man who is facing the right general way and knows it. "Yorkshire, do you think?" I said. "Or further," a pause. "She moves. She has been moving since she left Derbyshire. She would keep moving north because that is the direction that was taking her away from wherever she needed to be away from." He was still looking at the hills. "And eventually she would stop moving when she found somewhere she felt settled enough to stay." I looked at him. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the view. "Northumberland," I said. "Or thereabouts," he said, "or Durham, something north." He turned his horse back toward the estate. "We'll find her." He said it the way you say something you believe in the way you believe that 2 and 2 make 4, not with effort or conviction, but simply as a statement of the way things are. "We'll find her. Not I hope we'll find her, not I believe we'll find her, but we'll find her." I followed him back toward the house. We found her in Northumberland, 6 years later, exactly as he had thought north and eventually settled when she found somewhere she felt safe enough to stay. I thought about that ride on the North Ridge for a long time afterward, about how he had looked at the hills and said she was north of here and had been right, about what it means to know a thing with that quality of quietness, about whether it was something about him specifically, some particular quality of accurate attention, or whether it was simply the consequence of having thought about someone very carefully for 4 years, and therefore being able, on some level, to trace the logic of her movement. I believe it was both. I believe that the quality of attention he had brought to the 8 minutes at the market had given him something genuine, an impression not just of her face, but of how she was built, the logic of her character, and that in the years of thinking about her, he had developed from that impression a fairly accurate model of how she would behave in various circumstances. The model was not perfect. There were things about the 9 years that surprised him when she told him. There were things about her that were different from what he had expected, in ways he found interesting rather than disappointing. But the general direction of his inference, north, and settling eventually, when she found somewhere safe, was right. He had paid attention. And attention, paid with sufficient care to something sufficiently real, produces something like knowledge. Not complete knowledge, but something. I want to tell you also about the chess. The chess I have mentioned before, the games in the evenings, the 3 or 4 times a week that was our established rhythm for most of the years of the search. But I have not said much about the games themselves, and I think the games say something. Crispin played chess the way he did everything, thoroughly and with complete attention, and with the particular quality of mind that sees several steps ahead and considers what the board will look like under various conditions before committing to a move. He was very good. He won, as I have said, more often than he lost, and I am not a bad player. But in the middle years of the search, from approximately 1814 to 1818, when the inquiry was producing fragments without the central piece, something shifted in the games, not in his skill. He was as technically accomplished as he had always been, but there was a quality that entered the games that had not been there before, which was a slight tendency to play toward endgames that were complicated rather than clean. To choose lines that were more involved, more extended, more uncertain of outcome, over lines that were shorter and more decisive. This was not a worse way to play chess, necessarily, but it was different from how he had played before. I thought about this. I think what it was is that in those years, he had developed a great deal of experience with complicated endgames, situations where the outcome was not yet determined, where the important thing was to keep all the possibilities in play as long as possible, where the patient continuation of the game was more valuable than an early resolution. He had been living inside a complicated endgame for several years, and the quality of mind it required had transferred slightly to how he played chess. After 1820, the games changed again. They became slightly shorter on average. The lines he chose were not simpler exactly, but more direct. The quality of patience that had entered the game in the middle years was still there, but it was no longer compensating for something absent. It was simply patience, the ordinary patience of a man who knows that the game is worth playing and plays it well, without anything extraneous in the quality of the playing. I noticed the change. I mentioned it to him once obliquely. He said, "I have had a sufficiency of extended endgames." I said, "I imagine you have." He beat me in 11 moves, which was very fast for him, and which I took as its own kind of statement. Now let me tell you about the day after the wedding in Caldburn, because there is something about it that I have not told anyone, and that I think belongs to this account. The wedding was on a Thursday in June. The party, small as it was, dispersed over the course of the afternoon, and by evening it was only Crispin and Alina and me and my wife, and Mrs. Fallow, who had appointed herself the evening's hostess in the absence of a family to do so, and Mrs. Dorothea Ashby, who was staying for several weeks. We had a very quiet dinner, and the evening was warm, and afterward we sat outside in the garden of the house the Tanners had put at our disposal, and the Northumberland summer evening went on, and on the way northern summer evenings do. At some point my wife and Mrs. Ashby went inside. Mrs. Fallow had already gone home. I was left with Crispin and Alina, sitting on either side of me, and the light was still warm on the hills, and there were birds somewhere in the garden making the evening sounds that birds make when the day has been good. Alina said, after a comfortable period of silence, "Mrs. Fallow told me something, before the visit, before you came to Caldburn." Crispin looked at her. "She said the letter you wrote to Prentice, the first one, asking him to make inquiries at the beginning, contained a sentence that she found very striking. She had heard about it from a neighbor who had heard it from someone who had spoken to Prentice's contact in the village. She paused. She said the sentence was, "I am looking for a woman I do not know, but I know that I am looking for her." Crispin was still for a moment. "Did I write that?" he said. "Apparently," she said. He thought about it. "I believe I did," he said at last. "The first instruction to Prentice, 1811. He was quiet. I was trying to explain to him the nature of the inquiry without explaining more than I wished to explain at that stage. "I am looking for a woman I do not know," she repeated very quietly, "but I know that I am looking for her." "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The evening light was very gold by then, low on the hills, and it caught the side of her face in the way that summer evening light in the north catches things, and she was looking at him with an expression I can only describe as recognition. Not of him, particularly, though that was part of it, but of something larger, of what the whole thing had been. "That is," she said at last, "an extremely exact thing to have known." "Yes," he said, "I thought so." "Most people," she said, "know what they are looking for, or they know that they are looking, one or the other." "Not usually both," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. The birds went on in the garden. The light went lower. "I was not looking," she said, "at any particular point in those 9 years, but I had not stopped thinking about the conversation we were going to have, about the book, about the natural history text and what I was going to say about it." She paused. "So I was not looking, but I was in some sense ready to be found." He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the hills, and the evening light was on her, and she had the settled composure that was entirely and exactly hers, and he was looking at her with the expression that I have been trying to describe since the night in the library in November of 1810, when I first understood that this was a condition and not a mood. He had found the word for the expression, I realized, watching him. Not in a way that he would say aloud, not in the way of a man who announces his feelings for the purpose of being heard, but in the way of a man who has spent a long time not quite having the word for something, and who has now arrived, definitively, at the right word, and is carrying it with the completeness of something finally properly named. I did not say anything. After a while, Elena turned from the hills and looked at me. "Are you going to be all right?" she said, "without the inquiry to manage?" I blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The inquiry," she said, with a slight smile. "It has been your primary occupation for 10 years from what I understand, now that it is concluded." "I have other occupations," I said, somewhat defensively. "Chess," she said, "yes." "And the jackdaws?" "The jackdaws were a single winter," I said. "They made a strong impression." Crispin, beside me, was very quiet in the way he was quiet when he was entertained. "I shall," I said with dignity, "find ways to occupy myself." "The inquiry did produce some interesting correspondence," she said, "if you wish to review it for archival purposes." "I do not need to review it for archival purposes," I said. "I am intimately familiar with its contents." "I thought you might be," she said. She was, I thought, going to be very good at this, at being in his life, at being in mine by extension. She understood, she had already understood, in the fortnight of letters and the first visit and this evening, exactly who the people around her were, and what they were to each other, and what she was coming into, and she had found her place in it with the same composed efficiency with which she had found her place in everything else, which was, entirely and exactly herself. The sun went below the hills. The birds were quieter. The evening smelled of the warm grass and somewhere distantly of flowers, and the Northumberland summer was exactly as long and exactly as good as Northumberland summers always are. We sat there until the light was gone. I will say this last thing, and then I will truly stop. Some years after the marriage, I believe it was 1824 or 1825, which would place it approximately 4 or 5 years in, I came to Thornville for Christmas, which I did every year. My wife came as well, and our children, and the house was full in the way that was quite different from the old Thornville fullness, which had been the fullness of a house correctly managed and correct in its management. The new Thornville fullness was the kind that involves children in the corridors and Mrs. Ashby in the garden, and a quantity of books in various rooms, and a geological specimen of some significance that Crispin had recently acquired and was anxious to discuss, and Elena was also anxious to discuss, from a different angle. On one of the mornings of that Christmas, I woke early and went downstairs and found, again, the library empty and the fire made up, and the morning light coming in from the frost-bright east. I went to the window. They were not in the orchard this time. It was December and the apple trees were bare. They were in the walled garden. I could see them through the library window in the early morning light, Crispin in his dark coat, Elena in her blue cloak, which she still wore, the same one from the wedding. They were standing at the far end of the walled garden by the wall that caught the most winter sun, and they were looking at something on the wall, a plant of some kind, something that was surviving the winter against the warm stone. She was pointing at it. He was looking at where she pointed with the focused attention he gave to everything that interested him, and she was saying something, and he was nodding. They were there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then they turned and walked back toward the house, close together in the cold morning, and I stepped back from the window so they would not see me looking, because the moment was theirs and not mine, and I had already had more than my share of it by watching. I stood in the library and listened to them come in through the garden door, and Elena's voice saying something about the wall plant that I could not quite hear, and Crispin's response lower, that I could not hear at all, but that had the quality of warmth that his voice had acquired over the years of the marriage, and that was very different from the correct and slightly remote quality it had had before. I stood in the library and thought about the market at Brentwood Cross in October of 1810. I thought about the flower stall and the apple stall next to it. I thought about the older woman selling the flowers, who was Mrs. Dorothea Ashby, and who was at that moment asleep in her cottage at the edge of the home farm. I thought about the ink on the fingers and the book under the flowers and the laugh that was genuine rather than polite. I thought about Felton arriving with the letters. I thought about the expression on Crispin's face when he turned back and found the space where she had been empty. I thought about 8 minutes and 10 years, and a man in a schoolroom in April with the northern light coming in and a woman standing by a blackboard and both of them arriving, at last, at the place where the thing that had always been true between them could be, finally, actually lived. It is a long way, sometimes, from the glimpse to the arrival. The distance between seeing something true and having it in your actual life is sometimes very considerable, and the crossing of that distance requires, I have thought about this, a particular quality of both patience and commitment that is not common. Most people, encountering a glimpse, either pursue it too quickly and arrive at something that is not quite what they glimpsed, or wait too long and find that the glimpse has dimmed past recovery. The narrow path between these two errors requires knowing what you saw, and trusting it, and being willing to follow it at the pace it requires without either forcing it or abandoning it. Crispin had known what he saw, he had trusted it. He had followed it at the pace the inquiry required, which was, in his case, the pace of methodical inquiry through several English counties, over 9 years, without loss of confidence in the original observation. And he had arrived. That is what I thought about, standing in the library in December, with the frost on the windows and the fire warming the room and the sound of 2 people in the hall, coming in from the garden, talking about a plant on a south-facing wall. And then the library door opened, and Elena came in with her cheeks pink from the cold and her eyes bright and a notebook in her hand. She had brought the notebook to the garden, I realized, to record something, and she said, "Good morning, Hadley. Are you well?" I said I was very well. She said, "He thinks the wall plant is an unusual specimen of clematis. I think it is not. Do you have a view?" I told her I had no view on the matter whatsoever. She found this very funny and said so, and went to find her natural history texts, and Crispin came in after her, and the morning at Thornville began in the usual way, which was to say, with argument and attention and 2 people who knew with complete accuracy that they were exactly where they were meant to be. That is, finally, and without further extension, the whole of it. There is a conversation I should have recorded earlier but did not, because it happened in the spring of 1813, and at the time I did not understand its significance. I understand it now, and so I will put it here, even though chronologically it belongs between the Beverly Lead and the Countess of Harwick. We were at Thornville in May of 1813. A family of Crispin's distant cousins, a Mrs. Vane Alderton and her 3 daughters, who were in the neighborhood for a fortnight and had been invited to stay, were at the house. The daughters were of various ages and various degrees of eligibility, and Mrs. Vane Alderton had the look of a woman who had made calculations about the Duke's situation and was prepared to advance them with some subtlety, which she did. She was not an unpleasant woman. She was simply a woman with daughters and a clear view of the arithmetic. On a Wednesday evening after dinner, the daughters played music. Two of them played well. One of them played extraordinarily well, the youngest, a Miss Cecily Vane Alderton, who was 19 and had a genuine gift, and who performed a piece of some technical difficulty with a composure that made the other members of the party sit forward in their chairs. I watched Crispin during the performance. He listened with complete attention, as he always listened to music that was technically good. His expression was appreciative and engaged. And then Miss Cecily finished and the room applauded, and Mrs. Vane Alderton looked at her youngest daughter, and then, with some transparency, at the Duke, and Miss Cecily blushed appropriately, and the moment had the quality of a well-rehearsed play arriving at its key scene. Crispin said to Miss Cecily, "That was excellent. Scarlatti, I believe, the K380 sonata." Miss Cecily confirmed that it was, and said she had been practicing it for some months, and that she had found the fingering in the second movement particularly challenging. Crispin said, "The arpeggios in the crossing passages, yes. Did you approach them as a technical exercise or as an interpretive problem?" Miss Cecily blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The arpeggios," he said. "Some performers treat them as a finger speed exercise, others treat them as a color problem. What shade of touch produces the right articulation for that passage? Which did you find more useful?" Miss Cecily looked briefly, as if she were not sure which answer was expected. Then she said, carefully, that she supposed she had approached it as a technical exercise. Crispin said, "Ah, yes, that is the conventional approach." He said it pleasantly and without any particular emphasis, and the conversation moved on, and Miss Cecily was no worse for the exchange, and Mrs. Vane Alderton made one more subtle attempt over the following 2 days and then gave it up with evident good sense. Later that evening, when the guests had gone to bed and Crispin and I were in the library, I said, "The arpeggios." "Yes," he said. "You asked her a question that had no good casual answer." "I asked her a genuine question," he said. "I was interested in whether she had thought about it as a color problem, because the best performances of that passage treat it as one." "You asked a genuine question," I agreed. That had the effect of revealing that she had not thought about it that way. He was quiet for a moment. "That was not the intention." "I know it wasn't," I looked at him. "Do you see, though, what you were doing?" He thought about this with the serious attention he gave to things that were being pointed out to him accurately. "I was being direct," he said at last. "You were being yourself," I said. "And the situation was one in which being yourself was somewhat unkind, possibly, to someone who was very young and very well-intentioned." "Yes," he said. He accepted this without defensiveness. "I should have been less direct." "Perhaps," I said, "but here's what I want to say about it, and I want you to hear it because I think it matters." I paused to be sure he was listening. "You cannot be less direct than you are. You can manage it better at times. You can calibrate when directness is required and when it is not. But the quality itself, the noticing of things and the saying of what you notice, is not something you can remove without removing something essential about you." Another pause. "And the woman at the market did not require you to remove it. She was, you said so, entirely herself. She was direct in the same way you are direct. She observed things and said them." I paused. "The arpeggios were not the problem. The arpeggios were simply the wrong arpeggios." He looked at me for a long time. "Yes," he said at last, "that is exactly right." He said it quietly, and with the particular quality of recognition that he brought to things that were true, and that he had been circling around without quite landing on. "You cannot find a substitute for the thing itself," I said. "I know you know this, but I thought it was worth saying." "It is," he said. We did not talk about it further, but I thought about it many times in the years that followed, the Scarlatti K380 as the most compact possible illustration of what the search was actually about. Not a search for a woman of particular beauty or accomplishment or social position. A search for a woman who would hear the question about the arpeggios and not be thrown by it, because she would have thought about it herself, from her own independent interest in the question, and she would have an actual answer. Elinor, when I eventually told her this story, which I did, in a roundabout way, several years into the marriage, listened to the whole of it and then said, "And I would have said it's a color problem." "Would you?" "The Scarlatti K380, yes. The crossing passages are expressive, not mechanical. You have to decide what color they are before you can play them correctly. She paused. I would also have asked what he thought. And if he had a different view, then we would have argued about it, she said, and one of us would have been more right. He was right, I said. Then I would have agreed with him, she said, after a reasonable interval for due consideration. She said this entirely seriously, and then looked at me with the slight expression that indicated she was aware of the comedy. And I laughed, and she allowed herself to laugh as well. And we were in the library at Thornville, where this whole business had started, on a winter afternoon when the frost was on the windows, and the fire was the best thing in the room, and all of it had come around to exactly where it should have been. I want to say something, finally and properly, about the quality that Crispin had seen at the market and spent 10 years looking for. I have called it in this account various things entirely herself, genuine rather than polite, not adjusted for the occasion. These are accurate as far as they go, but they are descriptions of a surface quality, and the surface quality is not the point. The surface quality is the evidence of the point. The point is this. Most people in Crispin's experience, and I mean this not as a criticism of most people, because most people have very good reasons for what they do, most people adjust. They sense the room, they sense the audience, they calibrate their presentation for the circumstances. This is rational behavior and often kind behavior, and the world runs more smoothly for it. A woman who has been taught, correctly, that a duke is a significant presence will adjust her presentation for that significance, and this is not dishonesty, it is simply social competence. What Crispin encountered at the market was a woman who had not adjusted. She had made the observation about the western light and the apple stalls as if he were simply a person, and she had laughed at the apple's remark as if it were simply funny, and she had been composing an answer to the question he was going to ask about the natural history text as if the question were simply interesting. All of this without adjustment. He had recognized this immediately. He had recognized it not because he was starved of it, or not only because of that, but because he had the quality of attention to recognize authentic things when they appeared, and he had encountered very few things that authentic. What he had seen in those 8 minutes was a mind in its own company, not performing for him, not adjusting for him, simply thinking and observing, and saying what it observed, and finding the conversation interesting because it was interesting. He had seen a person who was, in the fullest sense of that phrase, entirely there. This is not common. It sounds like it should be common. Surely most people are entirely there in their own company going about their daily business, and many are. But most people, in the presence of a strange man of obvious wealth and position, at a market stall in Derbyshire, would introduce a degree of management into the encounter that would have been visible, if you were paying the kind of attention Crispin paid. She had not, and what he had recognized, in that lack of management, was not simply her freedom from social convention. He had recognized the specific quality of mind that does not manage itself for an audience because it does not occur to it to do so, because it is too genuinely occupied with what is actually in front of it to spare the attention for performance. She had been looking at the apples when he spoke to her. She had been thinking about the apples, the western light, the relationship between prominence and quality, because she was a person who noticed things and thought about what she noticed, and the thinking was more interesting to her than the social management. He had a mind of the same kind. He noticed things and thought about what he noticed. He asked genuine questions and was genuinely interested in the answers. He said the accurate thing, and sometimes the accurate thing was funny, and he was generally surprised when it was because he had not been thinking about being funny, he had been thinking about what was accurate. Two people with this quality of mind, meeting at a market in Derbyshire in October of 1810, had a conversation about apples that was, in its small way, exactly what a conversation should be. Two genuine observations meeting, producing something that was more interesting than either observation alone. And then the courier arrived, and one of those minds had to go deal with the business of England, and the other one moved on with a basket of late chrysanthemums, and an answer to a question that had not been fully asked. And the first mind spent 10 years trying to get back to that conversation. I believe, and this is my conclusion, after 40 years of knowing Crispin Vane and however many years of knowing a leaner Ashby, that what he was doing in those 10 years was not seeking a woman. He was seeking a conversation. The woman was the conversation, and the conversation was what he had recognized in 8 minutes, and the search was the search for the place where the conversation could continue. He found it. They have been having it in one form or another, about apples, about natural history, about limestone, about scarlatti, about the color of arpeggios, about the children in 3 schools, about the Ribston pippin in the snow, about the plant on the south wall in December. They have been having it ever since. I have been permitted to overhear parts of it over the years. I have found it the most interesting conversation I have ever been adjacent to. I do not expect to find a better one. That is the whole of it, and more than the whole of it, and all I have to say. I want to record one more thing, because it happened recently, within the past month, as I write this, and because it is the kind of thing that belongs at the end of a long account, as a final evidence of everything the account has been trying to show. I was at Thornville for a week in the autumn. My wife was with me, and our eldest son and his wife, and 3 grandchildren, of whom the eldest is now 8 years old, and has the particular quality of attention that 8-year-olds have at their best. The focused, unfiltered noticing of a person who has not yet learned to manage their attention for social purposes, and who therefore pays it, fully and without remainder, to whatever is actually in front of them. On the 2nd day of our stay, this grandchild, whose name is Thomas, and who is the one I mentioned earlier, the one I told the story to, attached himself to Alina with the quiet completeness of a child who has found an adult who will actually answer questions. Alina took him into the garden and showed him the south border and the winter-hardy plants, and told him the names of things, and he listened with the concentrated seriousness of a person who is filing information very carefully, because he intends to use it. At luncheon, he was seated next to Crispin, and he said, in the direct way of children who have decided that a question is worth asking, "Did you really spend 10 years looking for her?" Crispin looked at him. "Where did you hear that?" "My grandfather told me," said Thomas. "He said you spent 10 years looking for her because you met her for 8 minutes and wanted to ask her about a book." Crispin looked at me. I looked at the table. "That is approximately accurate," Crispin said. "Why didn't you just write down her name?" Thomas asked. "When you first met her." "I didn't know her name," Crispin said. Thomas considered this. "Why didn't you ask her?" "I was going to," Crispin said. "I was interrupted." "Why didn't you go back and ask after?" "She had left by the time I was free to go back." Thomas thought about this with the methodical seriousness of a child who is genuinely trying to understand a problem. She could have come back to the market. "She could have," Crispin agreed. "I looked for her there." "But she wasn't there." "No. So then what did you do?" "I looked other places," Crispin said, "for 10 years. Thomas absorbed this. He was eating his lunch with great economy, the way children eat when they are thinking about something else. Then he said, "Was it worth it?" Crispin was quiet for a moment. He looked at Alina, who was at the other end of the table, engaged in a conversation with my wife about something botanical that I could not quite hear. She was, at that moment, doing what she always did, which was paying complete attention to the conversation she was in, without any division of attention toward the other conversations in the room. She had not heard Thomas's question, or if she had, she was not showing it. Crispin watched her for a moment, then he looked back at Thomas. "Yes," he said. Thomas nodded, with the nod of a child who has received a satisfactory answer to a question. "I thought it probably was," he said, "because my grandfather seemed to think it was a good story. He usually only tells stories he thinks are good." "Your grandfather," Crispin said, looking at me, "is a generous judge of stories." "He said yours was the best one he knew," Thomas said. I cleared my throat. The table looked at me. "I may have said something of that kind," I said. "You said it was the most interesting thing you'd ever watched happen," Thomas said helpfully, with the precision of a child who was paying attention during the telling and retains the exact wording. "That is also possible," I said. "It is the most interesting thing I have ever watched happen," I told the table generally, because there seemed no point in denying it. "Over a period of approximately 40 years. Including the jackdaws, the Lancashire inquiry, the Scarlatti conversation, and the Ribston pippin in the snow." Alina, at the other end of the table, turned from her conversation with my wife and looked at me. "You're adding to it," she said, "every time you tell it." I am recalling additional details, I said with dignity. The Scarlatti conversation, she said, was not in the first version. The first version was 40 years ago. I have had time to consider what was relevant. And the Ribston Pippin in the snow. That was very relevant, I said. She looked at me with the quick, direct look, and then she looked at Crispin, and he was looking at her with the expression that I have been trying all my life to name correctly. He's going to keep adding to it, she said, until it is twice as long. I know, said Crispin. Should we be concerned? Hadley has been telling stories about me since we were 8 years old, Crispin said. I have accepted that it is the arrangement. What was he like at 8? She asked. Very like now, Crispin said. Argumentative about the price of things, attached to lost causes, unable to leave a good story alone. I am not argumentative about the price of things, I said. The pike, Crispin said, at Brentwood Cross in October of 1810. There was a brief silence around the table. The fishmonger was overcharging, I said. He was, Crispin agreed. And I was right about the pike. You were, Crispin agreed. You have always been right about the pike. It is simply unfortunate that arguing with the fishmonger about the pike is why you were not watching where she went. This was a point I had no answer to. I had not had an answer to it in 14 years. I did not have one now. Thomas looked between us with the bright attention of a child who has recognized that the adults are playing a game he enjoys and wants to follow. He was arguing about a fish, he said to a leaner, and that's why he didn't see where you went. Apparently, she said. He should have been watching, Thomas said. Yes, she agreed. But then he told the story, Thomas said, so it came out all right. That is, I said, with as much dignity as I could manage, a very accurate summary of the situation. Thomas went back to his lunch, satisfied. The conversation moved on. Crispin and a leaner continued at their respective ends of the table, each in their own conversation, occasionally finding each other across the length of it with the ease of people who know exactly where the other is and are not required to demonstrate this knowledge, because it is simply known. I watched this. I have watched it for 4 years now, since the wedding, and I have not yet stopped finding it remarkable. Not in the way that new things are remarkable, because it has long since ceased to be new. Remarkable in the way that things which are correctly made are remarkable, not for their novelty, but for the quality of their construction. For the fact that they are exactly what they are, without excess and without deficiency, and that this is not an accident but the consequence of a great deal of very careful work, over a very long period, by 2 people who understood what they were building before they had quite finished the building. He saw her only once at the market. He spent 10 years searching for her name. What he built at the end of 10 years was not simply a marriage. It was the continuation of a conversation that had been interrupted, and the repair of an interruption, and the resumption of something that had been waiting for 10 years to be resumed. The conversation is still going. I have been privileged to overhear it. Thomas will hear more of it as he grows up, because he is the kind of child who will find it worth attending to. I am no longer quite young enough to promise I will be there for all of it. But I was there for the beginning. And the beginning, a man at a market asking a woman about late apples, noticing a book in her basket, about to ask a question, was exactly right. Everything that followed from it has been exactly right as well. That is all, that is everything, that is enough.